They called her a witch before they ever asked her name. In Hollow Bend, Texas, where the sun bakes mercy out of men's hearts and gossip flows faster than whiskey, Clara Wynn was tied to a post in the town square, wrists bleeding, dignity stripped, accused of sins she never committed. But this isn't a story about how hate wins. This is about the rancher who cut her loose when everyone else looked away. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. The rope burns on Clara Wynn's wrists weren't the worst part. It wasn't even the hunger gnawing at her belly after 2 days without food or the way her legs had gone numb from kneeling in the same position since yesterday's dawn. No, the worst part was recognizing every single face in the crowd that had gathered to watch her suffer. There was Martha Hendricks, who'd borrowed Clara's cast-iron Dutch oven just 3 weeks ago and returned it with a pound cake as thanks. There was young Timothy Marsh, whose reading primer Clara had mended with careful stitches when his mother couldn't afford a new one. And there, standing with his arms crossed and his chin held high like he was performing some holy duty, was Reverend Samuel Cartwright, the same man who'd blessed Clara's late mother's grave and promised to look after her daughter. They all stared at her now like she was something diseased, something dangerous, something that needed to be contained or, better yet, eliminated. "Witch," someone shouted from the back of the crowd, and the word rippled forward like poison spreading through clear water. Clara's lips were cracked and bleeding from the heat, but she didn't bother defending herself anymore. She'd screamed herself hoarse the first day, explaining over and over that she'd done nothing wrong, that she'd never cursed anyone, that she didn't even know how to curse anyone. But Hollow Bend didn't want explanations. They wanted a scapegoat, and Clara, heavy-set, unmarried, and too independent for their comfort, made for an easy target. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on her bare head. Someone had torn off her bonnet during the initial dragging through town, and now her dark hair hung in sweat-soaked tangles around her face. Her dress, once a respectable blue cotton, was torn at the shoulder and stained with dust and blood. She could feel the wood of the post digging into her spine, rough and unforgiving. "She killed my baby." That was Loretta Pike, the sheriff's wife, her voice shrill with grief that had curdled into rage. "My baby was healthy until that woman," she pointed a trembling finger at Clara, "until she came by with that cursed tea." Clara closed her eyes. The tea had been peppermint and chamomile, a simple remedy for morning sickness that Clara's own mother had used. She'd offered it out of kindness when she'd run into Loretta at the general store, noticing how pale and queasy the woman looked. How was Clara supposed to know that 3 days later Loretta would miscarry? How was she supposed to know that grief and superstition would transform an act of compassion into evidence of witchcraft? "I didn't," Clara started, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. She swallowed, tasting blood, and tried again. "I didn't do anything to your baby, Loretta. I'm sorry for your loss, but it wasn't—" "Liar!" Loretta shrieked, and the crowd murmured its agreement, a low rumble of collective certainty that needed no evidence, no trial, no truth beyond what they'd already decided to believe. Behind Loretta stood her husband, Sheriff Tom Pike, his badge catching the sunlight. He wouldn't meet Clara's eyes. That told her everything she needed to know about justice in Hollow Bend. The law wore a tin star, but it bent to whatever wind blew strongest, and right now that wind howled with accusation and fear. But the real architect of Clara's destruction stood slightly apart from the crowd, watching the proceedings with the satisfied air of a man surveying property he'd just acquired. Eli Carver was Hollow Bend's wealthiest citizen, owner of the largest ranch in 3 counties, and a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. He wore a tailored suit despite the heat, his silver hair slicked back with pomade, his mustache waxed to sharp points. Everything about him spoke of control, of power, of a man who'd built an empire and crushed anyone who stood in his way. And Clara Wynn, unfortunately, had been standing in his way. Her property, a modest 20 acres on the eastern edge of town, sat atop an underground spring that fed the richest water source in the region. Clara's mother had known about it, had guarded it carefully, had made Clara promise never to sell to anyone, especially not to Eli Carver, who'd been trying to buy the land for years. When Clara's mother died last winter, and Clara inherited the property, Carver had shown up at her door within a week, offering what he called a generous sum. When Clara refused, citing her mother's wishes, Carver's expression had gone cold. "You'll regret this, Miss Wynn," he'd said, tipping his hat in a gesture that held no courtesy. A woman alone on land like that? Why, all sorts of unfortunate things can happen. Claire had thought he meant bandits or wild animals. She hadn't realized he meant her own neighbors weaponized by carefully planted rumors and exploited grief. "The Lord says thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Reverend Cartwright's voice boomed across the square, and Clara's eyes snapped open. The preacher stood on the steps of his church, his Bible held high like a sword. "This woman has brought darkness to our town. She has consorted with evil forces. And now, by the grace of God and the wisdom of this community, she will face judgment." "We already know she's guilty," someone shouted. "String her up. Burn her." The calls came faster now, feeding off each other's energy. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd heard stories of witch trials, of course, Salem, centuries ago, a cautionary tale of hysteria and injustice. But those were history relics of a less enlightened age. This was 1887, for God's sake. They had telegraphs and railroads and please. Clara forced the word out, her voice cracking. "Please just listen." But no one was listening. They were too busy working themselves into a frenzy, too eager for the satisfaction of righteous violence, too convinced of their own virtue to hear anything that contradicted the story they'd told themselves. Eli Carver caught her eye across the square and smiled. It was a small smile, barely noticeable to anyone else, but Clara saw it clearly. This was his doing. This was his revenge for her refusal, his solution to the problem of a stubborn woman who wouldn't surrender what he wanted. By the time this was over, she'd be dead, and her property with no living relatives to inherit it would go to auction. And Eli Carver always won at auctions. Clara dropped her head forward, tears finally breaking through her defenses. She'd been strong for 2 days, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry, but she couldn't hold it back anymore. This was how it would end. Not with justice, not with mercy, but with a mob's fury and a rich man's greed. The sun climbed higher, and the crowd's bloodlust grew with it. Then, cutting through the noise like a knife through cloth, came the sound of hoofbeats. Everyone turned. At the far end of the square where the main road entered town, a rider approached. Even from a distance, Claire could see he sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent more time in the saddle than on foot. As he drew closer, details emerged: a dusty brown duster, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a rifle in a saddle holster, and something in the set of his jaw that suggested he'd seen things that made a mob of angry townspeople look like a Sunday social. The rider didn't hurry, but he didn't slow down either. He rode straight into the square, straight toward the post where Clara was bound, and the crowd parted before him like water around a stone. He dismounted in one smooth motion, his boots hitting the dirt with a solid thud. When he straightened and pushed back his hat, Clara saw a face weathered by sun and wind. Sharp cheekbones, eyes the color of flint, and a scar that traced a pale line from his left temple down to his jaw. He was maybe 40, maybe older. The kind of man whose age you couldn't pin down because hard living had carved away anything soft or young. "What's going on here?" His voice was quiet, but it carried. It was the voice of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. Sheriff Pike stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture that was probably meant to look authoritative but came off as nervous. "This is town business, stranger. Best you move along." The rider's eyes swept across the scene, Clara bound to the post, the hostile crowd, the preacher with his Bible, Eli Carver watching from his privileged position. When his gaze returned to the sheriff, something dangerous flickered in those flint-gray eyes. "Town business," he repeated, his tone flat. "That what you call tying up a woman and leaving her in the sun to die. She's a witch." Loretta Pike pushed past her husband, her face blotchy with tears and rage. "She killed my baby with her devil's brew. She deserves everything she gets." The rider looked at Clara, really looked at her, and for the first time in 2 days, someone saw her as a human being rather than a symbol of their fears. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened just slightly. "That true?" he asked Clara directly. "You kill this woman's baby." Clara's throat was so dry she could barely speak, but she forced the words out. "I gave her peppermint tea for morning sickness, that's all. I wouldn't." The rider nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. He turned back to the crowd. "So let me understand this. A woman has a miscarriage tragic, yes, but something that happens every day across this country, and your response is to tie up another woman and torture her in the town square. She's evil, someone shouted. She consorts with demons, added another voice. The writer's jaw tightened. I've seen evil. I've tracked it across territories and put bullets in its heart. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that evil doesn't look like an exhausted woman tied to a post by her own neighbors. Eli Carver stepped forward now, his polished boots clicking against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. Mr. Red, Jonas Red. Something flickered across Carver's face. Recognition, maybe, or wariness. Mr. Red, I appreciate your concern for proper procedure, but this woman has been judged by the people of this town. We have rules here. We have order. You have a lynch mob, Jonas said flatly. There's a difference. The good book says, Reverend Cartwright began, but Jonas cut him off. The good book says a lot of things. Pretty sure love thy neighbor is in there somewhere. He paused, letting that sink in, then added, also pretty sure there's something about bearing false witness. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few people looked at their feet, but the majority remained firm in their conviction, their fear of the unknown stronger than any appeal to scripture or decency. Jonas took a step toward the post. Sheriff Pike moved to block him. Can't let you do that, Mr. Red. This is a matter for who? For you. Jonas's voice remained quiet, but there was steel underneath now. You're the law in this town, Sheriff. You took an oath. Pretty sure that oath didn't include standing by while a woman gets tortured based on superstition and gossip. Pike's face reddened. Now you listen here? No. Jonas's hand dropped to his belt where a Colt revolver hung in a worn holster. He didn't draw it, didn't even touch it, but the gesture was clear. You listen. I'm going to cut this woman loose. I'm going to get her some water, and then I'm going to take her somewhere safe. And unless you want to start shooting unarmed travelers in front of God and everybody, you're going to let me do it. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Eli Carver's voice cut through the tension, smooth as silk. Mr. Red, I don't believe you understand the situation. This woman owns land that's vital to this community's development. If she were to leave under irregular circumstances, it could create legal complications. Surely you can see the wisdom in allowing local matters to be resolved locally. There it was, the real reason laid bare. Jonas's eyes narrowed. Ah, so this isn't about witchcraft at all. This is about land. This is about justice, Loretta wailed, but her voice sounded hollow now, less certain. Jonas ignored her, his attention fixed on Carver. Let me guess. She wouldn't sell to you, so you waited for something, anything that could turn the town against her. Sheriff's wife loses a baby, tragic as that is, and suddenly you've got your opportunity. Plant a few rumors, stoke a little fear, and watch the mob do your dirty work. Then once she's dead, the land goes to auction, and you conveniently make the winning bid. That about right. Carver's smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold. That's quite an imagination you have, Mr. Red, but even if your wild theory were true, what exactly do you plan to do about it? You're one man. We're an entire town. Jonas pulled a knife from his belt, not a threat, but a tool. He walked past the sheriff, who made a half-hearted motion to stop him, but ultimately stepped aside. Jonas knelt beside Clara, his movements deliberate and calm, and began sawing through the ropes binding her wrists. You're right, Jonas said, not looking at Carver. His attention focused on his work. I'm one man, but I'm one man who's too tired and too mean to care about popular opinion anymore. The rope frayed and snapped. Clara's hands fell free, and she gasped as blood rushed back into her fingers. Jonas caught her as she slumped forward, her legs unable to support her weight. And I'll tell you something else. I've got a camp about 5 miles north of here up in the hills where the creek runs clear. Good water, good grazing, and no neighbors who think a woman deserves to die for the crime of owning something they want. He stood lifting Clara with him. She was heavier than he'd expected, solid and real. Not the frail victim he'd half imagined, but he adjusted his grip and held her steady. Her head lolled against his shoulder, consciousness slipping as her body registered safety and gave in to exhaustion. You can't just take her, Reverend Cartwright protested. This is kidnapping. This is called not being a coward, Jonas said. He looked at the crowd, really looked at them, and his voice carried a weight that made more than a few people flinch. You all know what you were about to do here. You know it was wrong, and you're going to have to live with that knowledge every time you look in a mirror. I'd say I hope it keeps you up at night, but I doubt most of you will lose a minute of sleep. That's the thing about good people doing evil, they're always real good at justifying it to themselves. He started walking toward his horse, Clara held against his chest. No one moved to stop him. Sheriff Pike looked at Carver, waiting for orders, but Carver just watched, calculating. He could order the mob to attack, could probably overwhelm this stranger through sheer numbers, but that would be messy. Bodies, witnesses, complications. Better to let this play out to wait for another opportunity. Carver was a patient man, and patience had made him rich. Jonas reached his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that stood steady despite the crowd's energy. Getting Clara onto the saddle while keeping her secure was going to be tricky, but Jonas had handled harder tasks. He positioned her carefully, then swung up behind her, one arm locked around her waist to keep her from falling. One more thing, Jonas said, looking down at the assembled townspeople. If anyone follows us, if anyone tries to finish what you started here today, they're going to find out why they used to call me the gravedigger back in my bounty hunting days. And trust me, I earned that name. He didn't wait for a response. He turned the horse and rode out of the square at an easy walk, unhurried, as if he were taking a Sunday ride instead of abducting the town's designated witch. The crowd watched him go, their bloodlust deflated by the sheer audacity of what they'd just witnessed. As Jonas and Clara disappeared down the road, Eli Carver pulled a gold watch from his vest pocket and checked the time, his expression thoughtful. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But it had gotten more interesting, and Eli Carver had always enjoyed a challenge. In the town square, the rope that had bound Clara Wynne still lay in the dust, its fibers stained with her blood. No one picked it up. No one acknowledged it. They simply drifted away back to their homes and shops and churches, already beginning the process of forgetting, of revising, of telling themselves that they hadn't really been going to hurt her, that they'd just been scared, that they'd just been trying to protect their families. By evening, the square was empty, except for the post standing sentinel, over nothing, a monument to cowardice dressed up as righteousness. 5 miles north, where the hills rose up from the flatlands and the mesquite gave way to juniper and live oak, Jonas Red's camp sat in a small clearing beside a creek that ran year-round. It wasn't much: a canvas tent, a fire ring, a corral for his horse, and a few supplies packed in weatherproof crates. But it was peaceful, and after the ugliness in Hollow Bend, peace felt like water in a desert. Jonas had laid Clara on a blanket near the creek where the sound of running water might soothe her when she woke. He'd cleaned the rope burns on her wrists as gently as he could, applied a salve his late wife had taught him to make from comfrey and calendula, and wrapped them in clean bandages. He'd gotten water into her just a little at first, knowing that too much too fast could make her sick. Then he'd sat back and waited, watching her breathe, grateful that she was breathing at all. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for a day that had held so much cruelty. Jonas built up the fire not because he needed the heat, the night would be warm, but because fire was company, and he'd been alone for a long time. Clara stirred as darkness fell. Her eyes opened slowly, confusion giving way to memory giving way to fear. She tried to sit up, her movements jerky and panicked. "Easy," Jonas said from across the fire. "You're safe. We're 5 miles from town. No one's coming." Clara's eyes found him in the firelight. She was silent for a long moment, processing, remembering. Then, in a voice hoarse from disuse and trauma, she asked, "Why?" It was a simple question, but Jonas knew what she was really asking. Why did you help me? Why did you risk yourself? Why did you care when no one else did? He considered his answer carefully, watching the flames dance. "I had a wife once," he finally said. "Sarah. She was good. Too good for me, probably, but she married me anyway. We had a little ranch, nothing fancy, just enough to get by. And then one day when I was away tracking a fugitive, some men came. They wanted our water rights. Sarah refused to sign the papers, so they made it look like an accident, a fall from a horse, a broken neck." He paused, the old grief still sharp after all these years. Everyone believed it. Why wouldn't they? Accidents happen. But I knew. I knew because when I came home and found her, there were bruises on her arms where they'd held her down. The horse was still saddled wrong, the way someone who didn't know horses would do it. And the men who wanted our land were at the funeral offering their condolences, acting like they gave a damn. Clara listened, her own pain temporarily forgotten in the face of his. I couldn't prove anything, Jonas continued. Couldn't bring her back, but I could make sure I never stood by and let something like that happen again. So when I rode into your town today and saw what they were doing to you, he shrugged, I guess I saw Sarah, and I saw a chance to do the right thing even if it was too late for her. Tears streamed down Clara's face, but she made no sound. She was cried out, wrung dry by 2 days of terror and grief. Thank you, she whispered. I can't, just, thank you. Jonas nodded. You hungry? I've got beans and cornbread. Nothing fancy, but it'll keep you going. Clara realized she was starving. She nodded, and Jonas dished up food onto a tin plate, then brought it to her along with a canteen of water. She ate slowly at first, then faster, her body demanding fuel after days without. Jonas watched with satisfaction, glad to see her strength returning. When she'd finished, Clara set the plate aside and looked at him across the fire. That man, she said, Eli Carver. He orchestrated all of it. Of the rumors, the accusations, everything. He wants my land. There's a spring underneath it, one of the only reliable water sources for miles. My mother made me promise never to sell, especially not to him. She said men like Carver only take, they never give anything back. Your mother was right, Jonas said. I've known men like Carver. They're more dangerous than any outlaw because they hide behind respectability. They use the law instead of breaking it. They let other people do their violence so their own hands stay clean. So what do I do? Clara asked, and the desperation in her voice was heartbreaking. I can't go back. They'll kill me. But I can't run either. That land is all I have left of my family. My mother's buried there. My father, too. If I leave, Carver wins, and the next woman who stands in his way will end up tied to a post or worse. Jonas poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. Then I guess we make sure he doesn't win. Clara looked at him with surprise. You've already done more than anyone could ask. I can't expect you to... You're not expecting anything, Jonas interrupted. I'm offering. There's a difference. He met her eyes across the flames. I'm tired of running from ghosts, Clara. I'm tired of watching bad men win because good people are too scared to stop them. Maybe it's time I stood and fought for something again. And maybe your land, your mother's spring, is as good a thing as any to fight for. Clara's throat tightened with emotion. She'd been alone for so long since her mother died, really, maybe even before that. The people of Hollow Bend had tolerated her, but they'd never accepted her. She was too independent, too plain, too unwilling to simper and defer the way women were supposed to. And now here was this scarred stranger offering not pity, but partnership, not charity, but solidarity. I don't even know you, she said softly. Jonas smiled, and it transformed his hard face into something almost gentle. You know I cut you down when everyone else wanted you dead. That's a pretty good start. Despite everything, Clara laughed, a short, startled sound that surprised them both. It felt good, that laugh, like finding a green shoot growing through cracked earth. They talked long into the night, two damaged people finding unexpected connection in the space between trauma and hope. Jonas told her about his years as a bounty hunter, the men he'd tracked, the places he'd seen. Clara told him about her mother's herb garden, about teaching herself to read from her father's old books, about the small rebellions of living as an unmarried woman in a town that valued conformity above all else. As the fire burned down to embers and the stars wheeled overhead, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by fear. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Carver wouldn't give up easily, and the people of Hollow Bend had proven themselves capable of monstrous things. But tonight, in this small camp beside a creek that sang its ancient song, Clara Wynne was alive. She was free, and she was not alone. Jonas threw another log on the fire and leaned back against his saddle, his eyes on the darkness beyond the firelight. Get some rest, he said. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. First light, we start planning how to take back your life. Clara lay down on the blanket, her body exhausted but her mind racing. She thought about the spring beneath her land, the water that had sustained her family for generations. She thought about her mother's grave, the wildflowers that grew there every spring. She thought about the children in Hollow Bend growing up in a town that taught them to fear anything different, anything they couldn't control. And she thought about Jonas Red, this unexpected guardian, this man who'd ridden into her worst moment and refused to look away. As sleep finally claimed her, Clara Wynne made herself a promise she would survive this. She would reclaim what was hers. And somehow, some way, she would make sure that no other woman in Hollow Bend ever stood alone against the mob's fury. The creek whispered its agreement, flowing on toward morning, toward justice, toward whatever came next. Dawn broke over the Texas hills with the kind of gentle beauty that made yesterday's violence seem like a fever dream. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Jonas moving around camp with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to solitude. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache, and the bandages on her wrists were stiff with dried blood, but she was alive. That simple fact felt like a miracle. Jonas looked up from the fire as she stirred. "Coffee's ready. How'd you sleep?" "Better than I had any right to," Clara admitted, pushing herself upright with a wince. The world tilted slightly, and Jonas was there in an instant, his hand steady on her shoulder. "Easy. Your body's been through hell. Give it time to remember how to work." He handed her a tin cup filled with coffee so strong she could probably stand a spoon in it. "Drink this. Then we need to talk about what happens next." Clara wrapped her hands around the cup, savoring the warmth. The morning air still held night's chill, and despite the blanket Jonas had draped over her while she slept, she felt cold down to her bones. "I've been thinking about that, about what you said last night about fighting back." She met his eyes. "I want to. God knows I want to make Eli Carver pay for what he did. But I'm one woman with a burned reputation and no allies. What can I possibly do against a man who owns half the county?" Jonas settled back on his haunches, his coffee cup balanced on one knee. "You're thinking about this wrong. Carver's power comes from people believing he's untouchable. Break that belief, and you break him." He paused, studying her face in the early light. "Tell me about the spring, the one under your land." Claire's expression shifted memory, softening the hard lines that fear had carved. "It's old. My grandfather found it when he first claimed the property back in '52. He was drilling a well and hit an underground river, pure cold water that never runs dry even in the worst droughts. He built our house right over it with a pump in the kitchen that draws straight from the source." She smiled slightly. "My mother used to say that water was blessed, said it had healing properties. I always thought that was just her being fanciful. But I'll tell you this, our vegetable garden never failed, not once in 30 years. And our cattle were always healthier, stronger than anyone else's." "So Carver wants it for the water rights," Jonas said. "Not just for himself, but to control who else gets access. In country this dry, whoever controls the water controls everything. Grazing rights, crop yields, even where people can build. He could hold the whole region hostage." "That's exactly what my mother feared." Claire's voice went hard. She knew what kind of man Carver was. She'd seen him squeeze out smaller ranchers, buy up properties for pennies when families got desperate. He'd offer them just enough to leave town, but never enough to start over anywhere decent. She said he had a talent for breaking people without ever raising his voice. Jonas stood and walked to the edge of the clearing, looking out over the valley below where Hollow Bend sat like a collection of child's toys in the distance. "Here's what I know about men like Carver. They're bullies dressed in fine suits. They're used to winning because nobody fights back, not because they can't be beaten, but because fighting seems hopeless. So they get away with it again and again until they start believing their own myth." He turned back to Clara. "But every bully has a weak spot. We just need to find his." "And how do we do that?" A slow smile crossed Jonas's weathered face. "We go back to town." Clara's cup slipped from her fingers, coffee splashing onto the ground. "Are you insane? They'll kill me the moment I set foot in that square." "No, they won't." Jonas's voice was calm, certain. "Because you won't be alone. You'll have me. And more importantly, you'll have something Carver doesn't expect the truth and the courage to tell it." He walked back to the fire and refilled her cup. "People went along with that lynch mob yesterday because they were scared. Scared of Loretta's grief. Scared of Carver's influence. Scared of looking weak in front of their neighbors. But fear's a funny thing, Clara. It makes people do terrible things, and then they have to live with what they've done. Some of those folks are waking up this morning and feeling ashamed. We need to reach those people before Carver does. Clara shook her head slowly. You're asking me to trust the same people who tied me to a post and called me a witch? No. Jonas crouched down beside her, his gray eyes intense. I'm asking you to trust yourself, to trust that you're strong enough to face them down. Because that's the only way this ends, not with you running, not with you hiding, but with you standing up and forcing them to see what they did. To see you as a person instead of a scapegoat. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with challenge and possibility. Clara thought about her mother's grave, about the spring that had sustained 3 generations of her family, about the children in Hollow Bend who were learning that violence was acceptable as long as you called it righteousness. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 days ago, quiet and careful, trying not to make waves, hoping that if she just stayed small enough, nobody would notice her. That woman had ended up tied to a post anyway. What exactly did you have in mind? She asked. Jonas's smile widened. I'm glad you asked. They spent the next hour planning Jonas sketching diagrams in the dirt with a stick, while Clara added details about the town's layout, about who lived where, about which families had grudges against Carver, even if they were too scared to act on them. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to burn off the morning mist, they had the rough outline of a strategy, risky, audacious, and entirely dependent on people being better than they'd proven themselves to be just yesterday. This is crazy, Clara said, but there was something like hope in her voice. Probably, Jonas agreed. He stood and offered her his hand. But crazy's better than dead. Come on, we've got work to do before we make our move. He helped her to her feet, and this time she stood steady, her legs remembering their purpose. They spent the rest of the morning preparing. Jonas showed Clara how to load and fire his spare revolver, a small Smith & Wesson, that fit her hand better than she'd expected. She'd never fired a gun before. Her father had died when she was young, and her mother had no use for weapons, but Jonas was a patient teacher. He set up targets on a dead tree trunk and talked her through the mechanic's stance, grip sight, alignment, trigger squeeze. You're not going to become a gunfighter in one morning, he said after she'd fired through half a box of ammunition. But you need to know that you can defend yourself if it comes to that. Confidence matters as much as skill sometimes. If someone thinks you'll shoot, they're less likely to test you. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she reloaded, the weight of the weapon both alien and oddly comforting. I don't want to shoot anyone. I know, that's actually a good sign. The people you need to worry about are the ones who do want to. Jonas checked her stance one more time, adjusting the angle of her shoulders. But wanting and being willing are different things. If someone tries to hurt you, if someone threatens your life, you need to know you can pull that trigger. Not because you want to, but because your life matters. Because you deserve to survive. The words hit Clara harder than she'd expected. Your life matters. It seemed like such a simple statement, but she realized with sudden clarity that she'd stopped believing it somewhere along the way. She'd let Hollow Bend make her small, make her apologetic for taking up space, for owning land, for existing outside the narrow boundaries of what women were supposed to be. The rope burns on her wrists were just the physical manifestation of a violence that had been happening to her for years. The slow erosion of self-worth under the constant weight of other people's judgment. Again, Jonas said quietly, and Clara raised the revolver, sighted down the barrel, and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed across the valley, and a chunk of bark exploded off the target tree. Not a perfect shot, but close enough to matter. They practiced until Clara's arms ached, and her ears rang despite the cotton Jonas had given her to stuff in them. Then they moved on to other preparations. Jonas taught her how to saddle and unsaddle his horse, how to read weather signs in the clouds, how to find north by the stars. Practical skills for a woman who might need to survive on her own if things went wrong. But more than that, he was teaching her self-reliance, rebuilding the confidence that Hollow Bend had tried to destroy. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, they sat by the creek and ate a simple meal of hardtack and dried beef. Clara's stomach had settled enough to handle food, and she was surprised by how hungry she felt, how alive. Yesterday, she'd been certain she was going to die. Today, she was planning her resurrection. Can I ask you something? Clara said, watching the water tumble over smooth stones. Why haven't you settled down somewhere, built a new life after your wife died? You could have a ranch, a family, all the things most men want. Jonas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. I tried. After Sarah died, after I buried her and dealt with the men responsible, and yes, I dealt with them, though I'm not proud of how I thought maybe I could start over. Went south to Mexico, worked on a cattle ranch there for a year. But everywhere I went, I saw versions of the same thing. Powerful men taking what they wanted, weak men letting them. Women and children caught in the middle, suffering because nobody would stand up. He picked up a stone and tossed it into the creek. I realized I couldn't settle down because I'd never really left the war. Not the one between the states that ended in '65, but the war between people who take and people who build between cruelty and kindness. That war's still going. And I guess I figured if I couldn't have peace, at least I could fight on the right side. Clara reached out and touched his arm gently. That sounds lonely. It is, Jonas admitted, but loneliness doesn't kill you. Complicity does, slowly, piece by piece, until you can't recognize yourself in the mirror anymore. He looked at her with something like wonder. You could have given up, Clara. Yesterday, today, any moment between. You could have broken, and nobody would have blamed you. But you didn't. You're still here, still fighting. That takes a kind of strength most people never find. I don't feel strong, Clara said softly. I feel terrified. Good. Terror means you understand the stakes. It's the people who aren't scared that you have to worry about. They're either fools or liars. Jonas stood and brushed off his pants. Come on, we should head down before dark. I want to get into town after most folks have gone to bed, find someone who might be willing to listen before Carver knows we're back. Clara's stomach knotted with fresh anxiety, but she nodded and rose to her feet. They broke camp quickly, Jonas moving with practiced efficiency, while Clara helped as best she could, still learning the rhythms of this outdoor life. Within an hour, the tent was packed, the fire scattered, and all evidence of their presence erased. Only the flattened grass where Clara had slept remained, and even that would spring back by morning. They rode double on Jonas's horse, Clara seated in front with Jonas's arms on either side of her holding the reins. It was intimate in a way that should have felt uncomfortable, but somehow didn't. There was safety in his presence, a steadiness that Clara had never experienced with another person. Her mother had been loving but fragile, worn down by years of widowhood and struggle. The people of Hollow Bend had been neighbors but never friends, always keeping her at arm's length. Jonas was different. He'd seen her at her absolute worst and hadn't turned away. As they descended from the hills, the landscape shifted from juniper and oak back to mesquite and scrub grass. The air grew heavier, dust hanging in the still evening heat. Hollow Bend came into view as the sun touched the western horizon, its buildings painted gold and shadow, deceptively peaceful from a distance. Jonas guided the horse onto a lesser-used trail that skirted the town's eastern edge, keeping them hidden from casual observation. He seemed to know the land well for someone who'd just arrived, and Clara remembered his years as a bounty hunter tracking fugitives across territories. Reading terrain and planning approaches would have been second nature to him. They stopped in a small grove of cottonwoods about a quarter-mile from the last houses on the edge of town. Jonas dismounted first, then helped Clara down, his hand steady on her waist. "We wait here until full dark," he said quietly. "Then we move to Martha Hendricks' place. You said she was at the square yesterday." Clara nodded, shame coloring her cheeks at the memory. "She was. She didn't say anything, but she didn't stop them either. That's more common than you'd think, good people who freeze when they should act. But freezing isn't the same as active cruelty. If Martha borrowed your cookware and returned it with thanks, there's human decency in her. We just need to wake it up." Jonas checked the position of the sun, calculating. "Here's how this works. You knock on her door. I stay back out of sight, but close enough to intervene if needed. You tell her what really happened, not just with the tea, but with Carver, with his attempts to buy your land, with all of it. You give her the truth and the chance to do something with it. And if she slams the door in my face, then we move to the next person on the list, and the next, and the next. Eventually we'll find someone with enough conscience left to listen." Jonas's expression was grim but determined. "It only takes one Clara. One person willing to stand with you to corroborate your story, to challenge the narrative Carver's built. Once there's a crack in the wall, others will follow. People are followers by nature. They'll join the mob, but they'll also join the resistance if someone's brave enough to start it." They settled in to wait the silence between them comfortable now. Clara watched the town as lights began to flicker on in windows, families gathering for supper, the ordinary rhythms of life continuing as if nothing had happened. She wondered if any of them were thinking about her about what they'd almost done. Or had they already moved on, justified it to themselves, filed it away under necessary evils, and protecting our own? Full darkness came slowly, the sky deepening from blue to purple to black stars emerging one by one like witnesses. When the moon rose, a waning crescent that gave just enough light to navigate by Jonas stood and offered Clara his hand. Time to go. Remember, you're not begging for their help. You're offering them a chance to be better than they were yesterday. There's a difference. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, Jonas leading the way with the confidence of someone who could navigate by starlight alone. Martha Hendricks lived in a small house on the eastern edge of town, close enough to the main street to be respectable, but far enough that her husband's modest income as a clerk wouldn't be obvious from the address. Clara had always liked Martha. She was practical and kind, a woman who did her best in a world that didn't make kindness easy. They approached from the back using the cover of an old barn to stay hidden from neighboring houses. A single lamp burned in Martha's kitchen window. Through the gap in the curtains, Clara could see Martha alone at the table, her husband presumably already in bed. She was darning socks, her hands moving with automatic precision, while her face held an expression of deep unhappiness. "She knows," Jonas whispered, seeing the same thing Clara did. "She knows what she was part of, and it's eating at her. That's good. Guilt makes people receptive." Clara's heart hammered so hard she was certain it would wake the entire town. This was it, the moment where she either reclaimed her life or confirmed her status as an outcast forever. She looked back at Jonas one more time, drawing strength from his steady presence, then stepped up to Martha's back door and knocked. The darning fell from Martha's hands. She stood slowly, her face going pale, even in the lamplight. She approached the door with obvious trepidation, one hand clutching her shawl closed at her throat. "Who's there?" "Martha." Clara's voice was steady despite her fear. "It's Clara Wynne. I need to talk to you, please." A long silence. Clara could hear Martha's breathing through the door, quick and shallow with panic or shock or both. Then, with the sound of a bolt sliding back, the door opened a crack. Martha's eyes were wide and red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. "Clara, oh God, Clara, you shouldn't be here. If anyone sees you—" "I know the risks," Clara said quietly, "but I'm not running anymore. I'm not going to let Eli Carver and his lies destroy my life. And I'm not going to let this town pretend that what happened yesterday was justice." She met Martha's eyes, letting the other woman see the rope burns on her wrists, the exhaustion in her face, the absolute determination in her stance. "I'm giving you a chance, Martha. A chance to do the right thing when it matters. Will you let me in?" Martha's face crumpled. A sob broke from her throat, and she pulled the door open wide. "I'm so sorry, Clara. I'm so sorry. I should have said something. I should have stopped them, but I was scared, and I know," Clara said gently, stepping inside. The kitchen was warm and smelled of bread and coffee, achingly normal. "I'm not here for an apology, Martha. I'm here because I need your help. And because I think deep down you need to help me, for your own sake as much as mine." Jonas slipped in behind Clara and closed the door, his presence making Martha jump. "Who bore Jonas Red?" he said simply. "I'm the man who cut Clara loose yesterday. And before you ask, yes, I'm armed, but I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm here to make sure Clara gets a fair hearing, something your town should have given her in the first place." Martha sank back into her chair, her hands shaking. "I didn't know what to do. When Loretta started screaming about witchcraft, when Reverend Cartwright backed her up, when Eli Carver stood there nodding like it all made sense, I froze. And then it was happening too fast and there were too many people, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that the sheriff would handle it properly. That—" She broke off, fresh tears streaming down her face. "I knew it was wrong. Even while it was happening, I knew, but I didn't do anything." Clara pulled out a chair and sat across from Martha, reaching across the table to take the other woman's hands. "You can do something now. You can tell people the truth about what happened, about why it happened. You can help me expose Eli Carver for what he is." Martha's eyes widened with fear. "Expose Carver, Clara. He's the most powerful man in 3 counties. He could destroy my husband's career with a word. We'd lose everything. You'll lose more if you don't, Jonas said quietly. He'd positioned himself by the window where he could watch the street, but his attention was on Martha. You'll lose your self-respect, your ability to look your children in the eye and tell them to do the right thing, your faith that there's any decency left in the world. I've seen it happen to people they compromise once telling themselves it's practical, it's necessary, it's survival, and then they do it again and again, until one day they realize they've become the very thing they used to fear. Clara squeezed Martha's hands. I'm not asking you to stand alone. I'm asking you to stand with me, to be brave for both of us until I remember how to be brave for myself. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. Please, Martha. You were kind to me once. Be kind to me again. Help me fight back. The silence stretched out, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the mantel and the distant bark of a dog somewhere in town. Martha's internal struggle played out across her face, fear warring with conscience, self-preservation battling against basic decency. Finally, she took a shaky breath and nodded. What do you need me to do? Relief flooded through Clara so intensely it left her dizzy. One person. That was all it took to start. One person willing to stand up and say, this was wrong. Jonas had been right about that, as he seemed to be right about most things. Clara leaned forward, her voice low and urgent. Tell me everything you know about Eli Carver. Every rumor, every suspicion, every story you've heard. And then tell me who else in this town might be willing to listen if they knew the truth. Martha nodded slowly, then began to talk. The words came haltingly at first, then faster, as if a dam had broken inside her. She told them about other families Carver had pressured other properties he'd acquired under suspicious circumstances. She told them about the way he'd consolidated power over the years, placing allies in key positions, using his wealth to control who got loans from the bank, whose businesses thrived, and whose failed. She told them about his obsession with Clara's spring, how he'd been talking about it for years, how he'd told people at the last town meeting that something would have to be done, about that woman squatting on vital resources. He's been planning this, Martha said, her voice bitter with realization. Maybe not exactly how it happened, but he's been setting the stage for months, making sure people saw you as difficult, as strange, as someone outside the normal order of things. So when the opportunity came to blame you for Loretta's miscarriage, the ground was already prepared. All he had to do was water the seed and watch it grow. Jonas made a low sound of disgust. Classic strategy. You don't build a conspiracy in one day. You build it over time, shaping perceptions, isolating the target, making sure that when you finally strike, everyone agrees it was inevitable. So how do we fight it? Clara asked. How do we dismantle something he's been building for years? Martha stood abruptly and walked to a cupboard, pulling out a small leather journal. My husband works as a clerk at Carver's ranch office. He keeps the books, processes, the land deals. He's mentioned things over the years, discrepancies, properties sold for less than market value payments to people who don't seem to have provided any actual services. She set the journal on the table with a decisive thud. I started writing it down. Not because I planned to use it, but because it felt important to remember. To keep a record of what was really happening, even if I never showed it to anyone. Jonas picked up the journal and flipped through it, his expression growing harder with each page. This is good, real good. We've got dates, names, amounts. If even half of this is accurate, Carver's been running a systematic fraud operation for at least 5 years. He looked up at Martha with something like respect. You kept this secret from your husband. I had to, Martha said quietly. He's a good man, but he's scared. And rightfully so. If Carver knew he was married to someone documenting his crimes, my husband would be the next one in danger. I've been protecting him by staying silent. She looked at Clara, her eyes wet but determined. But I can't stay silent anymore, not after yesterday. Not after I stood there and watched them almost kill you. Clara felt tears prick her own eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for being braver than you had to be. I'm not brave yet, Martha said. But maybe I'm getting there. They spent the next hour going through Martha's notes, cross-referencing them with Clara's knowledge of local families and land holdings. A picture emerged of systematic exploitation. Small ranchers pressured into selling at unfair prices, water rights transferred under questionable circumstances, loans, called in at strategic moments to force foreclosures. Carver hadn't just been trying to buy Clara's land. He'd been building a monopoly piece by piece, using every tool at his disposal: financial pressure, social isolation, and when those failed, outright fraud. The question is, Jonas said, how do we use this information? We can't go to the sheriff. He's either in Carver's pocket or too weak to stand against him. We can't rely on Reverend Cartwright. He proved yesterday that his faith bends whichever way the wind blows. So who in this town has the authority and the integrity to actually do something? Martha thought for a moment. Then her eyes lit up. Judge Morrison. He's semi-retired, only comes into town once a month to hear cases, but he's from the old guard. Came to Texas before statehood, fought in the war, built his reputation on being incorruptible. Carver's tried to influence him before and got nowhere. The judge doesn't attend the local church, doesn't socialize with the town leadership, just does his job and goes home. If anyone would give Clara a fair hearing, it's him. When's he due back in town? Jonas asked. 3 days. He holds court every second Saturday. Martha's expression turned calculating. If we could get him to hear Clara's case, not for witchcraft, that's absurd, but for slander or property disputes or something with actual legal standing, and if we could present this evidence, then we'd have a chance, Clara finished, a real chance to expose what Carver's been doing and reclaim my land and my reputation at the same time. Jonas nodded slowly. 3 days. That gives us time to gather more evidence to find other people who might be willing to testify. But it also gives Carver time to figure out we're back in town and make his own moves. We'll need to be smart about this, strategic. A knock at the front door made all three of them freeze. Martha's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. The knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by a familiar voice. Martha, you still awake? I saw your lamp burning. It was Vera Lang, the wealthy widow Martha had mentioned Carver's ally, and if the gossip was accurate, his occasional companion. Of all the people to show up at this moment, Vera was possibly the worst. Jonas moved silently to the side of the door leading to the parlor, his hand on his gun. Clara pressed herself against the wall beside the kitchen doorway, out of sight from the front of the house. Martha looked between them with mounting panic, but Jonas gave her a steady look and mouthed one word: normal. Martha took a shaky breath, smoothed her dress, and walked to the front door. They heard her open it, heard her voice pitched to false casualness. Vera, what brings you by so late? I couldn't sleep. Vera's voice carried clearly through the house, cultured and sharp. After everything that happened yesterday, I've been thinking about that Wynn woman, wondering if we were too hasty, if perhaps we should have. Well, it doesn't matter now, does it? She's gone. Run off with that stranger. Good riddance, I say. Yes, Martha said weakly. Good riddance. Although, Vera's tone shifted, became confidential. Eli's concerned she might try to come back, might try to claim she was wronged, stir up trouble. He wanted me to check in with some of the ladies, remind them how dangerous she is, how important it is that we all maintain a united front. For the town's safety, you understand. In the kitchen, Clara's hands clenched into fists. So it had already begun Carver's campaign to ensure that even if she returned, no one would listen. I understand, Martha said, and Clara could hear the tremor in her voice, the fear of being discovered. You can count on me to maintain the unity. I knew I could trust you, Martha. You've always been sensible. Vera paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had taken on a speculative quality. Is that coffee I smell? Fresh coffee this late at night. Clara's heart stopped. She'd accepted Martha's offer of coffee when they'd first sat down, and Martha had brewed a fresh pot. Now 3 cups sat on the kitchen table, visible to anyone who walked through the parlor door. Martha's response came too quickly. Oh, that's from earlier. I reheated it. You know how I hate to waste. The sound was non-committal, suspicious. Well, I should let you get to bed, but Martha. If you happen to hear anything unusual, see anything strange, especially involving that Wynn woman, you'll let me know immediately, won't you? Eli would be very grateful, and you know how generous he can be to his friends. The implication was clear. There were rewards for loyalty and consequences for betrayal. Clara felt rage building in her chest, hot and fierce. This was how Carver maintained his power, not just through fear, but through a system of patronage that made complicity profitable. "Of course," Martha said. "Good night, Vera." The door closed. They heard Martha's footsteps return to the kitchen, heard her collapse into a chair with a shaky exhale. "She suspects something," Martha whispered. "She'll tell Carver and he'll She suspects you made coffee," Jonas interrupted calmly, emerging from his hiding spot. "That's all. Even if she mentions it to Carver, there's nothing concrete there, just paranoia and guesswork." But his expression was troubled. "Still, she's right about one thing. Carver knows to expect trouble. He's already working to shore up his defenses, make sure everyone stays in line. That makes our job harder." Clara stepped into the lamplight, her jaw set with determination. "Then we don't wait 3 days for the judge. We start building our case now tonight. Who else in this town might be willing to help us? Who else has been hurt by Carver?" Martha thought hard, her fingers drumming on the table. The Johnsons lost their ranch 2 years ago. Bank called in their loan early, and Carver bought the property at auction for half what it was worth. They're bitter about it, living in that old shack by the creek now. And then there's Samuel Chen, runs the laundry. He's had trouble with Carver over water rates, claims he's being charged triple what everyone else pays. And old Mrs. Blackwood, the school teacher. She's been trying to get funding for a new schoolhouse for years, but Carver keeps blocking it at town meetings. Says education is wasted on children who'll just end up working ranches anyway. Jonas pulled out Martha's journal and started making notes in the margins. "Good. That gives us multiple angles: financial fraud, discriminatory pricing, obstruction of public good. We build a case that shows a pattern of abuse, not just an isolated incident with Clara. That way, even if people want to dismiss her story as personal grudge, they have to contend with multiple victims speaking up." "But will they speak up?" Clara asked. "The Johnsons, Samuel Chen, Mrs. Blackwood, they all have reasons to stay quiet, just like Martha did. What makes you think they'll risk Carver's wrath now?" Jonas looked at her with those steady gray eyes. "Because you'll ask them to. Because you'll show them what courage looks like. Because sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say no more. And suddenly everyone realizes they're not alone in their fear, not alone in their anger, not alone in their desire for justice." He stood and moved to the window again, checking the street. "We should go. We've been here too long already, and after Vera's visit, it's not safe to stay. Martha, can you reach out to the others tomorrow? Quietly, carefully, but reach out. Tell them Clara's alive, that she's coming back, and that she's not coming back alone. See who's willing to meet with us, hear what we have to say." Martha nodded, her earlier fear replaced by something harder, more resolved. "I can do that. I've been silent long enough. It's time I used my voice for something that matters." Clara hugged her, sudden and fierce. "Thank you. I won't forget this. Whatever happens, I won't forget that you chose to help when you didn't have to." "Just promise me something," Martha said, pulling back to look Clara in the eye. "Promise me you'll survive this. That you'll get your land back and your life back. That you'll make Carver pay for what he's done, not just to you, but to all of us. He's hurt over the years. Promise me this will have been worth the risk." "I promise," Clara said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They slipped out the back door into darkness that felt less oppressive now, less like a shroud, and more like a shield. Jonas led the way back to where they'd left his horse, moving with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent years tracking dangerous men through dangerous places. Clara followed, her hand resting on the grip of the revolver Jonas had given her, ready to use it if necessary, prepared to fight for her right to exist in this town that had tried so hard to erase her. As they rode back toward the hills, Clara looked back at Hollow Bend one last time. Somewhere down there, Eli Carver was sleeping peacefully in his big house, confident in his power, certain that he'd won. He had no idea that the woman he'd tried to destroy was gathering an army, small and ragged though it might be. He had no idea that his carefully constructed empire of intimidation and corruption was about to face its first real challenge in years. And he definitely had no idea that Clara Wynne was done being afraid. The next 2 days passed in a blur of careful planning and cautious meetings. Jonas and Clara made their camp deeper in the hills this time, in a box canyon that offered multiple escape routes and clear sightlines of anyone approaching. It was the kind of place a man chose when he'd spent years staying one step ahead of people who wanted him dead, and Clara was learning to think that way too, always watching, always calculating, always prepared to run or fight depending on which direction danger came from. Martha proved to be braver and more resourceful than even Clara had hoped. She moved through Hollow Bend like a woman on a mission, having quiet conversations in the general store, lingering after church services to whisper in carefully chosen ears, dropping hints and half-truths that led people to seek her out rather than the other way around. By the second evening, she'd arranged for 3 people to meet with Clara at different times in different locations, each one chosen for maximum discretion and minimum risk of discovery. The first meeting happened in the pre-dawn darkness at the abandoned Howell barn on the outskirts of town. Thomas and Elizabeth Johnson arrived on foot, their faces haggard in the lantern light Jonas had set up in the barn's hayloft. They were younger than Clara expected, probably in their early 30s, but hardship had aged them the way prairie wind ages fence posts, wearing them down to the essential grain. "Martha said you wanted to talk," Thomas said without preamble. His voice carried the flat affect of a man who'd learned not to hope for anything. "Said it was about Carver, about making him pay for what he's done." Clara stepped forward into the light, and Elizabeth gasped softly at the sight of her. "We thought you were dead, or run off for good. Everyone's saying exactly what Eli Carver wants them to say," Clara interrupted gently. "That I'm a witch, that I deserved what happened, that the town is better off without me. But none of that's true. What's true is that Carver wanted my land I wouldn't sell, and he found a way to destroy me for it, just like he destroyed you." Thomas's jaw tightened. "We weren't destroyed. We're still here." "Are you—" Jonas' voice came from the shadows where he'd positioned himself to watch the barn entrance. "From where I'm standing, you look like ghosts of who you used to be, living in poverty because a rich man decided your property was more valuable than your lives." Elizabeth's composure cracked. "We had everything. A good ranch, healthy cattle, our own water source. We were going to leave it to our children someday, build something that would last. And then the bank called in our loan 3 years early, said there was some clause we'd missed, some technicality. We couldn't raise the money in time, and Carver bought it at auction for a fraction of what it was worth." Her voice dropped to a bitter whisper. "He smiled at us during the bidding, like it was all just business, nothing personal, but it was personal. He wanted our land for the same reason he wants yours, Clara, because he's building an empire and he doesn't care who he crushes to do it." Clara pulled out Martha's journal and opened it to a page marked with a ribbon. "Martha's husband keeps Carver's books. According to these records, your loan shouldn't have been called early. There was no clause, no technicality. Carver bribed someone at the bank to fabricate the documents, and then he bought your property using money he'd embezzled from other land deals, essentially stealing from 6 families to steal from you." Thomas took the journal with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the neat columns of numbers and dates. When he looked up, there were tears on his weathered cheeks. "We could have fought this. If we'd had proof." "You can still fight it," Jonas said, stepping into the light. "Judge Morrison will be here in 2 days. If you're willing to testify about what happened to go on record about the circumstances of your loan and the auction, it corroborates Clara's story. It shows that Carver has a pattern of using fraud and intimidation to take what he wants. One victim might be dismissed. Multiple victims become evidence of systematic corruption." Elizabeth looked at her husband, an entire conversation passing between them in silence. Finally, Thomas nodded slowly. "We'll do it. God knows we've got nothing left to lose. Carver already took everything that mattered." He paused, then added quietly, "Except our dignity. He hasn't taken that yet, and I'll be damned if I'll let him." Clara felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of fear and isolation beginning to unravel. They weren't alone anymore. Whatever happened now, they weren't alone. The second meeting took place that afternoon in the back room of Samuel Chen's laundry, the air thick with steam and the sharp smell of lye soap. Samuel was a small man with quick, intelligent eyes and hands scarred from years of hard work. He listened to Clara's story without interrupting, occasionally nodding as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place in his mind. "The water rates," he said when she'd finished. "I always knew something was wrong, but I couldn't prove it. Carver owns the water company, controls all the lines into town. He charges me 3 times what he charges other businesses, says it's because I use more water for the laundry. But I've kept careful records. I use less than the hotel, less than the saloon, less than half a dozen other establishments. The only difference is that they're owned by white men who were born in Texas and I'm Chinese. Jonas leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. Discriminatory pricing. That's illegal under territorial law, and it'll stay illegal when Oklahoma becomes a state, which everyone knows is coming soon. A judge would have to take that seriously, especially with documentation. Samuel pulled out a worn ledger from beneath the counter, its pages filled with meticulous notations in both English and Chinese characters. Every bill, every payment, every complaint I've filed with the water company that got ignored. 5 years of evidence. He set it on the counter with a decisive thump. I came to this country because I was told it was a place where hard work mattered more than the circumstances of your birth. I built this business from nothing, and I've paid every debt, followed every law, been a good neighbor to people who mostly don't want me here. And still Carver treats me like I'm less than human, like he can rob me blind and I'll just accept it because that's what people like me are supposed to do. People like you? Clara asked softly. Samuel met her eyes. People who are different. People who don't fit into the neat categories this town prefers. You're an unmarried woman who owns land and refuses to be appropriately meek. I'm a Chinese immigrant who dared to establish a successful business. We're both reminders that the world is bigger and more complicated than Hollow Bend wants to acknowledge. So they try to push us out, or push us down, or in your case, eliminate us entirely. Clara reached across the counter and took Samuel's hand. Then let's remind them that different doesn't mean powerless, that they can't just erase us because we make them uncomfortable. Will you testify when the judge comes? Samuel's grip was firm despite his small stature. I've been waiting 5 years for someone to ask me that question. Yes, I'll testify, and I'll bring every page of documentation I have. Let Carver try to explain away 5 years of systematic theft. As they left the laundry through the back alley, Jonas pulled Clara into the shadow of an overhanging roof. You're good at this, he said quietly, at making people feel seen, heard, valued. That's a rare gift. Clara looked down at her rope-scarred wrists, remembering the feeling of the post against her back, the crowd's hatred washing over her like acid. I know what it feels like to be invisible, except when people want to hurt you. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. That's what I mean, Jonas said. You could have come out of that experience bitter, closed off, unwilling to trust anyone. Instead, you're building bridges. You're creating community where Carver tried to create isolation. That takes strength most people never find. Before Clara could respond, a young voice called out from the mouth of the alley. Miss Wynne, is that really you? They both turned to find a girl of about 12 standing there, her eyes wide with wonder and something like hope. Clara recognized her. After a moment, Emily Marsh, daughter of the widow Marsh, one of the children Clara had sometimes helped with reading when their mothers were too busy or too indifferent to teach them. Emily, Clara said, stepping forward, carefully aware that the girl might bolt like a startled deer. What are you doing out here alone? Looking for you, Emily said simply. Mama said you were dead or gone forever, but I didn't believe her. I remembered how you taught me to read, how patient you were when I kept mixing up my letters. I remembered how you were always kind, even when other people weren't. So when I heard whispers that you might be back, I started watching, and I saw you go into Mr. Chen's laundry, and I waited, and... She broke off suddenly, shy. I just wanted to see if you were okay, if you were really back. Clara's throat tightened with emotion. She knelt down to Emily's level, ignoring the protest of her still healing body. I'm back, and I'm going to fight to stay. But Emily, you can't tell anyone you saw me. Not your mother, not your friends, not anyone. It's not safe yet. Can you do that for me? Can you keep this secret a little longer? Emily nodded solemnly. I can keep secrets. I've been practicing. She paused, then added in a rush. Miss Wynne, I'm sorry about what they did to you. I'm sorry I didn't say anything. I wanted to, but I was scared, and I'm just a kid, and nobody listens to kids anyway, but I should have tried. I should have... Stop, Clara said gently, reaching out to cup the girl's face. You were a child in a crowd of adults who'd lost their minds. You're not responsible for their actions. You're only responsible for your own, and right now you're being very brave by coming to find me, by checking on me, even though it might get you in trouble. That's what matters. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Are you going to teach again? After all this is over, because I have a friend, Sarah, and she really wants to learn to read, but her papa says education is wasted on girls and— Yes, Clara said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Yes, I'm going to teach again. I'm going to open a real school, not just informal lessons on my porch. A place where any child who wants to learn can come regardless of what their parents think or what the town believes. A place where being different is celebrated instead of punished. Jonas made a small sound behind her, and when Clara glanced back, she saw something like pride in his expression. He'd been right yesterday when he said she had the power to change this town. She just hadn't believed him yet. But looking at Emily's face, seeing the hope bloom there like wildflowers after rain, Clara began to believe it might be possible. Emily threw her arms around Clara's neck in an impulsive hug, then pulled back and ran off down the alley before Clara could say anything more. They watched her disappear around the corner, a small figure carrying a message of resistance in her young heart. She'll tell someone, Jonas said pragmatically. Kids can't keep secrets, not really. By tomorrow, half the town will know you're back. I know, Clara said, standing slowly. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it's time to stop hiding. Time to step out into the light and make Carver face us directly instead of through proxies and rumors. Jonas studied her for a long moment. You're ready for that. For the confrontation that's coming. Clara thought about the past 3 days, about the terror of the post, about Jonas cutting her free, about Martha's courage, about Thomas, and Elizabeth's quiet strength, about Samuel's meticulous record-keeping, about Emily's hopeful face. She thought about her mother's grave and her father's memory, and the spring that ran beneath her land, pure and cold and endless. She thought about all the women and men and children who'd been crushed beneath Eli Carver's ambitions over the years, their dreams paved over to build his empire. Yes, she said, I'm ready. The third meeting happened that night, and it was the most dangerous. Mrs. Adelaide Blackwood was Hollow Bend's school teacher, a formidable woman in her 60s who'd taught 3 generations of children and suffered fools not at all. Getting her out of her house unnoticed required careful planning. Jonas created a diversion at the opposite end of town by setting off some fireworks he'd purchased from a traveling merchant while Clara slipped through Mrs. Blackwood's garden and tapped on her kitchen window. The older woman opened the window without surprise, as if she'd been expecting exactly this. Clara Wynne, I thought you might show up eventually. You never were good at staying down when someone tried to push you. She glanced toward the sound of explosions and shouting from the other end of town. Your friend's handiwork, I assume clever. Come in before someone notices. Clara climbed through the window with less grace than she'd have liked landing on Mrs. Blackwood's kitchen floor, with a thump that made the older woman's lips twitch with suppressed amusement. I've gotten out of practice at breaking and entering. One would hope so. Tea. Mrs. Blackwood was already filling the kettle without waiting for an answer. I suspect we have much to discuss, and I've always found that serious conversations go better with tea. It's the British in me, or rather the British that used to be in me before I came to this godforsaken frontier and became whatever I am now. Clara settled into a chair at the scrubbed wooden table, fascinated despite herself. She'd always respected Mrs. Blackwood, but had never really known her. The teacher kept to herself outside of school hours, living alone in this small house with her books and her cats and her sharp observations of human nature. You're probably wondering why I'm not surprised to see you, Mrs. Blackwood said, setting out cups with practiced efficiency. The truth is, I knew that business with Loretta's baby was nonsense from the start. I've been a teacher for 40 years, child. I've seen mob mentality destroy innocent people more times than I care to count. And I've seen Eli Carver manipulate this town like a puppeteer pulling strings ever since he arrived 20 years ago. Then why didn't you say anything? Clara asked, trying to keep the accusation out of her voice and failing. Mrs. Blackwood's expression turned grave. Because I tried once before and it nearly destroyed me. 10 years ago, Carver tried to shut down the school, said it was costing the town too much, that children should be learning practical skills from their parents instead of wasting time on books. I fought him at every town meeting, gathered support from parents, even got the Territorial Education Board involved. And I won, technically. The school stayed open. She paused to pour the tea, her hand steady but her voice bitter. But Carver doesn't forget and he doesn't forgive. For the next 5 years, I couldn't get funding for basic supplies. Books fell apart, and I had to replace them with my own money. The schoolhouse roof leaked, and the town council refused to authorize repairs until the winter it collapsed under heavy snow and nearly killed 3 children. Every proposal I made was blocked, every request denied. Carver turned my victory into a long, slow defeat. Clara accepted the tea, wrapping her cold hands around the warm cup. But you stayed. You kept teaching. I stayed because someone has to show these children that there's more to life than fear and compliance. That knowledge is power, that thinking for yourself is worth the risk, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Mrs. Blackwood sat down across from Clara, her back ramrod straight despite her age. But I'm old now, Clara. Tired. I don't have many fights left in me. So if you're here to ask for my help against Carver, you need to understand what you're asking. You're asking me to risk everything I've built, everything I've protected, everything I've sacrificed for. And I need to know that this time will be different, that this time we might actually win. Clara pulled out Martha's journal and Samuel's ledger, setting them on the table between them like offerings. We have evidence. Real documented proof of fraud, embezzlement, discriminatory practices, intimidation. We have multiple witnesses willing to testify when Judge Morrison arrives tomorrow. And we have something Carver doesn't expect: unity among the people he's spent years dividing and conquering. Mrs. Blackwood examined the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood the power of written records. Her expression shifted as she read, hardening from weary resignation into something sharper, more dangerous. When she finally looked up, her eyes held a fierce light that Clara imagined had intimidated countless misbehaving students over the decades. "Do you know what I've been fighting for all these years?" Mrs. Blackwood asked. "Not just education in the abstract, but specifically, I've been trying to get funding for a real school, not the one-room shack we currently use, but a proper building with separate classrooms, a library space for science equipment and art supplies. A place where children can grow into their full potential instead of being stunted by poverty and limited expectations." She tapped the journal with one finger. According to these records, Carver embezzled the education funds the territorial government allocated for that purpose. The money existed. It was earmarked specifically for schools. But Carver, who sits on the town council, redirected it into his own accounts. Clara felt rage building in her chest, hot and righteous. He stole from children, from their futures. He stole from everyone, Mrs. Blackwood corrected. But yes, particularly from the children. And that Miss Wynne is something I cannot forgive. Something I will not forgive. She stood abruptly and walked to a roll-top desk in the corner, pulling out a stack of letters and official documents. "I've been corresponding with the Territorial Education Board for years, documenting every denied request, every blocked proposal, every suspicious decision. I couldn't prove corruption before, but with this," she gestured to the journal, "I can connect the dots. I can show not just mismanagement, but deliberate theft." Jonas appeared at the kitchen window, materializing out of the darkness with barely a sound. Mrs. Blackwood opened it without being asked, and he climbed through with considerably more grace than Clara had managed. "The fireworks distraction worked," he reported. "Half the town is standing around arguing about who set them off and why. But we should wrap this up soon. Vera Lang was in the crowd and she was watching your house, Mrs. Blackwood. She's suspicious." "Let her be suspicious," Mrs. Blackwood said crisply. "I'm 63 years old. I've earned the right to do as I please. If Vera Lang wants to speculate about what I'm doing in my own kitchen at night, that's her concern, not mine." She turned to Clara. "I'll testify. I'll bring my correspondence with the Education Board, my records of denied funding, everything I have. And I'll encourage the parents of my students to attend the hearing, not to testify necessarily, but to be present to watch to see that someone is finally standing up to Carver. Sometimes the power of witness is as important as the power of testimony." Clara stood and embraced the older woman impulsively. Mrs. Blackwood stiffened for a moment, then relaxed and returned the hug with surprising strength. "Thank you," Clara whispered. "Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for staying." "Thank you for coming back," Mrs. Blackwood replied. "When I heard what they'd done to you when I saw you tied to that post." Her voice cracked slightly. "I should have done more. I should have used my position, my respect in the community, to stop it. Instead, I froze. I told myself it wasn't my place, that I needed to protect the school, that getting involved would only make things worse. I've been ashamed of that cowardice every moment since." You're doing more now, Jonas said quietly. That's what matters. Not the moments when we fail, but the moments when we find the courage to try again. They left through the garden, Mrs. Blackwood extinguishing her lamps and making a show of going to bed early in case Vera Lang was indeed watching. As they made their way back through the darkened streets toward the edge of town, Clara felt a profound shift in her understanding of Hollow Bend. She'd thought of it as a unified force arrayed against her, a monolithic enemy without cracks or weaknesses. But that wasn't true. The town was made up of individuals, some corrupted by power, some paralyzed by fear, but others desperately hoping for a chance to be brave, to be good, to be more than what Carver's reign had allowed them to become. They were almost to the safety of the outlying fields when a voice cut through the darkness. Well, well, what do we have here? 4 men stepped out from behind a barn, and even in the dim moonlight, Clara could see that they were armed. She recognized 2 of them ranch hands who worked for Carver rough men with reputations for violence. The other 2 were strangers, probably hired guns, brought in specifically for this purpose. Jonas's hand moved to his revolver with practiced speed, but he didn't draw. Not yet. "We don't want trouble," he said calmly. "We're just passing through." The largest of the men, a brute with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, laughed. "Passing through. That's interesting considering one of you is the witch who's supposed to be long gone and the other is the fool who cut her loose. Mr. Carver's been wondering when you'd show your faces again. He's eager to talk." "I bet he is," Jonas said, "but I don't think we're interested in that conversation. So how about you boys step aside and we'll all go home without any blood being spilled?" "Can't do that," Scarred Eyebrow said. "We've got orders. Bring you both in alive if possible. Dead if necessary. Mr. Carver doesn't really care which as long as the problem gets solved." Clara's heart hammered in her chest, but her voice came out steady when she spoke. "So Carver sends 4 armed men to deal with 1 unarmed woman and her friend. That doesn't sound like the actions of an innocent man defending his property. That sounds like the actions of a criminal trying to silence witnesses." "We're not here to debate philosophy, lady," one of the other men said, his hand resting on his gun belt. "We're here to do a job." "Then do it," Jonas said quietly, and something in his tone made all 4 men hesitate. "Draw your weapons. Try to take us. But understand something first. I've been killing men since before some of you were born. I've tracked outlaws across territories, faced down killers, in situations worse than this, and I'm still standing while they're all in the ground. You might get us. Probably will 4 against 2. But I guarantee at least 2 of you won't walk away. So ask yourselves if Carver's money is worth dying for." The tension stretched out taut as a wire ready to snap. Clara could see the calculations happening behind the men's eyes, weighing greed against self-preservation, loyalty against survival. Her hand drifted to her own revolver, the one Jonas had given her, and she tried to remember everything he'd taught her about stance and aim and breathing through the fear. Then cutting through the standoff like a knife through silk came the sound of a rifle being cocked. Everyone froze. "I believe the gentleman said they don't want trouble." Mrs. Blackwood's voice rang out from the roof of the barn, crisp and authoritative. "I suggest you take them at their word and disperse immediately." All eyes turned upward to find the elderly schoolteacher perched on the barn roof with a Winchester rifle held with the competence of someone who knew exactly how to use it. How she'd gotten up there so quickly and quietly was a mystery, but there she stood backlit by the moon looking like an avenging angel in a house dress. "This ain't your concern, Mrs. Blackwood," Scarred Eyebrow said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Everything that happens in this town is my concern," Mrs. Blackwood replied. "I've taught most of you boys. I remember when you were children before you decided that violence was easier than integrity. And I'm telling you now as someone who's lived long enough to see how these things end, walk away. Go back to Carver and tell him his intimidation tactics won't work. Tell him we're not afraid anymore." "There's only one of you," another man pointed out, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. "One of me up here, Mrs." Blackwood agreed. "But look around, count the windows, see how many lamps just got lit. How many faces are watching from doorways and porches? You really think you're going to drag these people through town without anyone seeing, without witnesses who will testify to what they saw? Carver's power depends on secrecy and silence. The moment you lay hands on Miss Wynne or Mr. Red, You lose both. Clara glanced around and realized Mrs. Blackwood was right. Lights were appearing in windows up and down the street. People were emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion, standing in their doorways with lamps and lanterns. Not intervening, not yet, but watching, bearing witness. And in that witnessing was a kind of power that Carver's hired guns couldn't overcome with violence. The four men seemed to realize it too. Scarred eyebrows spat into the dust, his expression murderous but impotent. "This ain't over, Sivisam," he said to Jonas. "You hear me? This ain't close to over." "I wouldn't expect it to be," Jonas replied calmly. "But tonight, right now, it's over. So walk away while you still can." The men backed off slowly, their hands never straying far from their weapons, but not drawing them either. They disappeared into the darkness, heading back toward Carver's ranch, and the collective tension of the street exhaled like a released breath. Mrs. Blackwood climbed down from the barn roof with surprising agility, dropping the last few feet to land lightly in the dust. Up close, Clara could see that the older woman was breathing hard, adrenaline making her hands shake slightly as she safetied the rifle. "I haven't done anything like that in 30 years, Mrs. Blackwood admitted. "My late husband taught me to shoot. Said a woman alone on the frontier needed to know how to protect herself. I always thought it was paranoid. Turns out he was right." "You saved our lives," Clara said simply. "I did what any decent person should have done 3 days ago," Mrs. Blackwood corrected. "I stood up, finally. Better late than never, I suppose." The people who'd emerged from their houses were starting to drift closer now, curiosity overcoming caution. Clara saw familiar faces in the lamplight. The baker and his wife, the blacksmith, young Mary Patterson, who worked at the hotel, old Tom Reeves, who'd lost a leg in the war. People she'd known all her life, people who'd stood silent while she was tied to a post. People who'd believed the worst of her because it was easier than questioning Eli Carver's narrative. And now they were looking at her with something that wasn't quite guilt, but wasn't quite hostility either. Confusion, maybe. Uncertainty. The first cracks in the foundation of their collective delusion. Jonas moved closer to Clara, his hand resting on the small of her back, not possessive but supportive, a reminder that she wasn't alone. "What do you want to do?" he asked quietly. Clara looked at the growing crowd, at their uncertain faces, at the town that had tried to kill her, and might yet try again. She thought about running about, disappearing into the night, and never looking back. It would be safer, smarter probably. But it would also mean letting Carver win, letting fear triumph over justice, letting all the people he'd hurt over the years continue to suffer in silence. She stepped forward into the lamplight, letting everyone see her clearly, the rope burns on her wrists, the exhaustion in her face, the absolute determination in her eyes. And then she spoke, her voice carrying in the still night air. "My name is Clara Wynne. Some of you have known me my whole life. Some of you borrowed my tools, sought my advice, accepted my help when you needed it. And 3 days ago you tied me to a post and left me to die in the sun because a rich man told you I was dangerous." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm not here to make you feel guilty, though you should feel guilty. I'm here because tomorrow Judge Morrison arrives. And I'm going to tell him everything about Eli Carver's corruption, about his fraud, about his systematic destruction of anyone who stands in his way. I'm going to expose what he's done not just to me, but to dozens of families in this town and the surrounding territory. And I'm asking you, all of you, to finally find the courage to see the truth, to stop letting fear control you, to stop letting one man's greed dictate all of our lives." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, from the back of the crowd, someone started clapping. Slow at first, then faster, then joined by others. Not everyone, many, still looked skeptical or frightened, but enough. Enough to show that something had shifted, that the monolithic wall of opposition was developing cracks, that Clara's return had changed the equation in ways Carver couldn't have anticipated. As the crowd began to disperse, people drifting back to their homes with plenty to think about. Martha pushed through to reach Clara. "You should have seen Carver's face when his men came back empty-handed," she whispered urgently. "I was walking past his house and I heard him shouting. He's scared, Clara. For the first time since I've known him, Eli Carver is actually scared." "Good," Clara said. "Let him be scared. Let him spend the night wondering what tomorrow will bring. Let him feel what it's like to have his carefully constructed world start to crumble around him." Jonas touched her elbow gently. We should go. We've made our statement. Now we need to make sure we survive until the judge arrives. They left Hollow Bend for the third time, but this time felt different. This time Clara wasn't running. She was retreating, strategically conserving her strength for the battle ahead. And as they rode back toward their camp in the hills, she found herself thinking not about the past, not about the post or the rope or the hatred in her neighbor's eyes, but about the future, about the school she would build, about the children she would teach, about the town that Hollow Bend could become if enough people found the courage to choose justice over complicity. The spring beneath her land ran pure and cold and endless, waiting for her return. Tomorrow she would fight for the right to reclaim it, and this time she wouldn't be fighting alone. Judge Harrison Morrison arrived in Hollow Bend at precisely 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, his black carriage pulled by a matched pair of gray horses that looked as dignified and uncompromising as their owner. He was a tall man in his 70s, rail-thin and ramrod straight, with a shock of white hair and eyes that had seen every variety of human behavior and found most of it wanting. He'd been dispensing justice in Texas territory since before most of the townspeople were born, and he had a reputation for two things: absolute integrity and zero tolerance for nonsense. Clara watched from the window of Martha's parlor as the judge's carriage rolled past, heading toward the courthouse at the center of town. Her stomach churned with nervous energy, and despite Martha's repeated assurances that everything would be fine, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that today would either save her life or end it permanently. He looks severe, Clara said, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Martha came to stand beside her, carrying 2 cups of coffee that neither of them really wanted, but that gave their hands something to do. Judge Morrison is severe, but he's also fair, which is more than you can say for most men in his position. My husband says the judge once threw a cattle baron in jail for contempt when the man tried to bribe him with $1,000 and prime grazing land. Said justice wasn't for sale at any price. Jonas stood near the door, checking his revolver for the 3rd time that morning. He'd been restless since dawn, his predator's instinct telling him that Carver wouldn't go down without a fight. The question isn't whether the judge is honest. The question is whether Carver will let this case proceed at all. He's had 12 hours to prepare his response to last night. He won't have wasted that time. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Eli Carver emerged from his house across the square, flanked by 2 well-dressed men Clara didn't recognize. Lawyers probably imported from Dallas or Austin or somewhere else where money could buy the kind of legal expertise that a small town like Hollow Bend couldn't provide. Carver himself looked unruffled. His silver hair perfectly groomed, his suit immaculate, his expression confident. If he was scared as Martha had reported last night, he'd mastered the art of hiding it behind a veneer of genteel civility. Look at him, Clara said bitterly. He's not worried at all. He thinks he's already won. Let him think that, Jonas replied. Overconfidence makes people careless, and we need him careless. The courthouse was already filling by the time they arrived, Martha and her husband accompanying Clara and Jonas through the front door while half the town watched from the square. The building was small and plain, its wooden benches worn smooth by decades of use, but it held the weight of law and the promise of justice concepts that felt almost foreign to Clara after everything she'd experienced. Thomas and Elizabeth Johnson were already seated near the front, their Sunday clothes carefully mended but clean. Samuel Chen sat alone on the opposite side, his ledger clutched against his chest like armor. Mrs. Blackwood occupied a bench near the back, surrounded by a cluster of women Clara recognized as mothers of her students. They'd come as witnesses just as the teacher had promised their presence a quiet statement of solidarity that made Clara's eyes burn with grateful tears. Reverend Cartwright sat in the front row on Carver's side, his Bible open on his lap, his expression pious and self-satisfied. Beside him was Vera Lang, dressed in expensive black silk that made her look like a crow at a funeral. Sheriff Pike stood near the wall, his hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture that was probably meant to look authoritative, but came across as nervous. And scattered throughout the room were ranch hands, business owners, and townspeople, some curious, some hostile, all waiting to see how this drama would unfold. Judge Morrison entered through a side door and took his seat behind the bench without ceremony. He surveyed the packed courtroom with those penetrating eyes missing nothing, and when he spoke, His voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime making decisions that shaped people's lives. This court is now in session. I understand we have several matters on the docket today, but I've been informed there's an urgent case requiring immediate attention. Miss Clara Wynne versus Mr. Eli Carver and the Township of Hollow Bend concerning unlawful detention slander and property disputes. He looked directly at Clara. Miss Wynne, I presume. Clara stood her legs threatening to buckle but holding steady through sheer force of will. Yes, Your Honor. And you're represented by counsel. No, Your Honor. I'm representing myself with the assistance of witnesses who've agreed to testify on my behalf. Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. That's unusual, but within your rights. And Mr. Carver, one of the well-dressed lawyers, stood smoothly. Benjamin Hartwell, Your Honor, representing Mr. Carver in this matter, we're prepared to demonstrate that these accusations are baseless and that my client has acted entirely within the bounds of law and propriety. We'll see about that, Judge Morrison said dryly. He gestured to Clara. Miss Wynne, this is your complaint. Present your case. Clara took a deep breath and stepped into the aisle, acutely aware of every eye in the room watching her. She'd rehearsed this moment with Jonas a dozen times, but standing here in reality was different from practicing in the safety of their camp. This was real. This mattered. This was her one chance to reclaim everything that had been taken from her. Your Honor, 6 days ago, I was forcibly taken from my home, tied to a post in the town square, and left there for 2 days without food, water, or medical attention. I was accused of witchcraft and blamed for the miscarriage suffered by Mrs. Loretta Pike. The entire town participated in or witnessed my detention, and no one, not the sheriff, not the reverend, not any person of authority, intervened to stop it. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke the words she'd been holding inside for days, finally finding release. This happened because I refused to sell my property to Mr. Eli Carver. He wanted my land because of the underground spring beneath it, and when I wouldn't give him what he wanted, he orchestrated a campaign of rumors and fear that turned my neighbors into a lynch mob. Hartwell was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. These are wild accusations without foundation. Miss Wynne has provided no evidence of Mr. Carver's involvement in what was clearly a spontaneous community response to a perceived threat. Spontaneous? Clara's voice rose with barely controlled fury. There was nothing spontaneous about it. Carver has been trying to buy my land for 2 years. He's made offers, threats, veiled warnings. And when none of that worked, he waited for an opportunity, any opportunity, to destroy my reputation and drive me out of town so he could acquire my property at auction after my death. Judge Morrison held up a hand. Miss Wynne, I understand you're emotional, but in this court we deal in evidence, not speculation. Can you prove that Mr. Carver orchestrated these events? I can prove a pattern of behavior. Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to call my first witness, Mrs. Martha Hendricks. Martha stood and made her way to the witness chair, her hands trembling but her voice steady as she was sworn in. Clara approached her gently, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. Mrs. Hendricks, you were present in the town square 6 days ago when I was tied to the post, correct? Yes, Martha said quietly. I was there. And can you describe what you saw? Martha's voice gained strength as she spoke. I saw a woman who'd done nothing wrong being treated like a criminal. I saw my neighbor's people I've known my whole life acting like a mob. And I saw Eli Carver standing at the edge of the crowd watching it all happen, smiling like he'd won something. Hartwell stood. Objection. The witness is characterizing Mr. Carver's expression based on her interpretation, not fact. Sustained, Judge Morrison said. Mrs. Hendricks, stick to what you observed directly. Martha nodded. I observed Mr. Carver watching Clara's detention without intervening. I observed him speaking quietly with Reverend Cartwright and Sheriff Pike. I observed him leaving the square with a satisfied expression while Clara remained tied to the post. She paused, then added, And I observed something else, Your Honor. My husband works as a clerk in Mr. Carver's ranch office. He keeps the books, and over the years I've kept my own records of certain irregularities. She pulled out the journal and Clara brought it to the judge's bench. Morrison took it, his expression unreadable as he flipped through the pages. The courtroom had gone silent, everyone straining to see what evidence Martha had provided. These are financial records, Judge Morrison said slowly. Documenting land purchases, loan transactions, and other business dealings. Where did you obtain these misses? Hendricks. My husband brings his work home sometimes, Martha said carefully. He's a meticulous record keeper. Sometimes too meticulous for Mr. Carver's comfort, I think. He documents everything, including transactions that don't quite add up. I started keeping my own log because I thought someday it might matter. Today it does. Carver's lawyer was on his feet objecting strenuously, but Judge Morrison waved him down. I'll allow it as evidence subject to authentication. We'll determine its relevance as we proceed. He looked at Clara. Continue, Miss Wynne. Clara called Thomas Johnson next. The young rancher told his story simply and powerfully, how his loan had been called early, how the auction had been rigged, how Carver had bought his property for a fraction of its value. He spoke without anger, just a terrible sadness that seemed to affect everyone in the courtroom. Did you attempt to contest the foreclosure? Clara asked. We did, Thomas said, but the paperwork seemed legitimate. We didn't have money for lawyers, and by the time we realized something was wrong, it was too late. Carver already had the deed. And according to the records Mrs. Hendricks provided, what do those documents show about your foreclosure? Thomas's voice hardened. They show that someone at the bank altered our loan terms without our knowledge or consent. They show that Carver paid that someone $300 2 weeks before our loan was called. And they show that Carver purchased our ranch using money he'd embezzled from a territorial education fund. The courtroom erupted. Judge Morrison's gavel came down hard, demanding order. Hartwell was shouting objections. Carver was conferring urgently with his other lawyer, and the townspeople were talking over each other in confusion and shock. Order! Morrison's voice cut through the chaos like a whip. I will have order in this court, or I will clear the room, Mr. Hartwell. Your objections are noted, but I'm going to hear this evidence. If you have contrary evidence, you'll have your opportunity to present it. Clara called Samuel Chen next. The laundry owner brought his 5 years of meticulous documentation, every water bill, every complaint, every payment made for services rendered at rates 3 times higher than what other businesses paid. He laid it out methodically, showing not just discrimination, but systematic theft. Why didn't you report this to the authorities? Clara asked. Samuel's smile was bitter. I did, multiple times. I filed complaints with the water company, with the town council, with the Territorial Commerce Commission. Nothing ever came of it. Mr. Carver owns the water company. Mr. Carver sits on the town council, and the Territorial Commission was too far away and too busy to care about one Chinese immigrant being overcharged for water. He looked directly at Judge Morrison. I learned that justice depends on who you are and how much power you have. I'm just a laundryman. I have no power. Until now, perhaps. Morrison studied Samuel's ledgers carefully, comparing dates and amounts, verifying the mathematics. When he looked up, his expression was grave. These are serious allegations, Mr. Chen. Are you prepared to swear under oath that these records are accurate? I am, Your Honor. Every entry was made by my own hand on the day the bill arrived or the payment was made. I have witnesses who can verify many of these transactions. Customers who were present when I received bill suppliers who saw the amounts I was charged. This is not speculation. This is documentation of 5 years of systematic theft. Mrs. Blackwood testified last, and she was magnificent. She spoke with the authority of age and experience, describing not just her own struggles with Carver, but the broader pattern of his control over the town. She brought her correspondence with the Territorial Education Board, showing that funds had been allocated for a new school, but had never arrived. She brought testimony from parents about the deteriorating conditions in the current schoolhouse. And she brought a list of other teachers in neighboring towns who'd experienced similar difficulties after crossing Carver in some way. This isn't just about one woman tied to a post, Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice ringing through the courtroom. This is about a systematic pattern of abuse, intimidation, and fraud perpetrated by a man who believes his wealth puts him above the law. Clara Wynne's case is just the most dramatic example, but every person in this room has been affected by Eli Carver's actions in one way or another. The question is whether we're going to continue accepting it or whether we're finally going to demand justice. When Mrs. Blackwood stepped down, the courtroom was silent. Clara could see people thinking, processing, connecting dots they'd previously ignored or dismissed. Even Reverend Cartwright looked troubled, his certainty wavering in the face of overwhelming evidence. Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to these allegations. I suggest you make it good." Hartwell stood, but for the first time since the hearing began, he looked uncertain. "Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence of all charges. The financial records presented are taken out of context and don't reflect what?" Morrison interrupted. "Don't reflect systematic fraud. Don't reflect embezzlement of public funds. Don't reflect discriminatory business practices. I've been on this bench for 35 years, Counselor. I know what corruption looks like when I see it." He turned to Carver. "Mr. Carver, I'm going to give you a chance to address these accusations directly. Stand up." Carver rose slowly, his composure finally cracking. "Your Honor, I've built this town. I've brought prosperity, jobs, opportunity. Everything I've done has been for the good of Hollow Bend and its citizens." "Everything?" Morrison's voice was cold. "Stealing from children is for their good. Driving families off their land through fraud is prosperity. Attempting to murder a woman who refused to sell her property is opportunity." He picked up Martha's journal and held it aloft. "This document contains enough evidence to bring criminal charges against you for embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and a dozen other offenses. And that's before we even get to the attempted murder charge for what was done to Miss Wynne. I had nothing to do with that." Carver's voice rose, control slipping. "The town decided she was dangerous. You merely orchestrated it," Clara said, stepping forward. "You planted the rumors. You encouraged Loretta's grief to turn into rage. You made sure Sheriff Pike wouldn't intervene. And you stood there watching, waiting for me to die so you could claim my land." Her voice was steady now, all fear burned away by righteous anger. "But I didn't die. I survived, and I came back. And now everyone can see what you really are." Carver's mask finally shattered. "You self-righteous bitch! You think you're better than me. You think your pathetic little plot of land matters in the grand scheme of things. I was building an empire. I was making something that would last. And you were nothing but an obstacle. A stubborn woman too stupid to understand that progress requires sacrifice." "Sacrifice!" Jonas's voice cut through the courtroom from where he stood near the back. He moved forward slowly, his hand resting on his gun. "Is that what you call murder now? Sacrifice?" Carver's eyes widened as he recognized Jonas, perhaps finally understanding that the man who'd cut Clara loose wasn't just some passing stranger, but someone far more dangerous. "This man has no standing in this court," Carver said desperately to Hartwell. "He's not even a resident of Hollow Bend." "No," Jonas agreed. "I'm not, but I'm a sworn deputy marshal of the Texas Territory, though I've been on personal leave for the past 5 years. He pulled a badge from his pocket and held it up. "I never resigned. I just stopped using it. Until now." The revelation sent another wave of shock through the courtroom. Clara stared at Jonas in surprise. He'd never mentioned being a lawman, though. In retrospect, it explained so much about his competence, his understanding of legal procedure, his absolute confidence in confronting Carver's hired guns. Judge Morrison's expression shifted to something almost approving. "A marshal. Well, that changes things. Deputy Red, do you have testimony to provide regarding this case?" "I do, Your Honor. I witnessed Miss Wynne's unlawful detention. I observed the sheriff's failure to intervene, and I heard Mr. Carver's hired men admit just last night that they'd been ordered to bring Miss Wynne and me to Carver, dead or alive, to prevent us from reaching this courthouse." He looked at Sheriff Pike. "Attempted murder, witness, intimidation, obstruction of justice. I can provide sworn testimony to all of it." Pike's face had gone white. "That's not... I didn't." "You didn't stop it," Jonas said coldly, "which makes you complicit. You swore an oath to uphold the law, Sheriff. You broke that oath the moment you stood by and watched an innocent woman be tortured in your town square." Judge Morrison's gavel came down with finality. "I've heard enough, Mr. Carver. I'm ordering an immediate investigation into your financial dealings, your business practices, and your involvement in the unlawful detention of Clara Wynne. Until that investigation is complete, your assets are frozen, and you are forbidden from leaving the jurisdiction of this court." He turned to Pike. Sheriff, as of this moment, you are suspended from duty pending a formal inquiry into your conduct. I'm appointing Deputy Marshal Red as interim sheriff until a suitable replacement can be found. The courtroom exploded again, but this time the energy was different. Not shock, but something closer to catharsis, as if a pressure valve had finally been released. Clara felt her knees go weak, and Martha caught her supporting her weight as relief flooded through her system. But Carver wasn't finished. His face had gone red with rage, all pretense of civility abandoned. You can't do this. I have rights. I have lawyers. You have nothing, Morrison said flatly. Nothing but a long list of crimes you'll be answering for. Bailiff, take Mr. Carver into custody. What happened next occurred so quickly that Clara barely had time to process it. Carver lunged toward the judge's bench, his hand reaching inside his jacket. Jonas moved faster, crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides and tackling Carver to the ground before whatever weapon he'd been reaching for could be drawn. The 2 men struggled briefly, but Jonas had size, skill, and righteousness on his side. Within seconds, Carver was face down on the courthouse floor, Jonas's knee in his back and his hands being secured with rope. Attempted assault on a judge, Jonas said calmly, as if subduing dangerous criminals in courtrooms was something he did every day. Add that to the list of charges, Your Honor. Morrison nodded, his expression grim but unsurprised. So noted. Get him out of my courtroom. As Carver was dragged away, still shouting threats and curses, the townspeople began to react. Some looked ashamed, others relieved, a few angry that their patron and protector had been brought down. But most, the vast majority, looked like people waking from a long nightmare, blinking in the sudden light, and trying to remember who they'd been before fear had made them into something unrecognizable. Reverend Cartwright stood abruptly and walked out without a word, his Bible clutched against his chest. Vera Lang followed, her face pale and frightened, probably already calculating how to distance herself from Carver's crimes. But others remained, and as Clara looked around the courtroom, she saw people she'd known her entire life looking at her with something that might eventually become respect. Judge Morrison called for order one final time. This court will reconvene in 30 days to hear the results of the investigation and to determine final disposition of Mr. Carver's properties and assets. In the meantime, Miss Wynne, I'm issuing an immediate injunction protecting your property from any sale transfer or encumbrance. You're free to return to your home without fear of further harassment. He paused, then added more gently, I apologize on behalf of the law for what was done to you. No citizen of this territory should ever be subjected to such treatment. The law failed you, Miss Wynne. I intend to ensure it doesn't happen again. Clara found her voice thick with emotion. Thank you, Your Honor. As the courtroom cleared, people approached Clara, hesitantly offering words of apology or support or simple acknowledgement of what had happened. Thomas and Elizabeth Johnson hugged her tightly, tears streaming down their faces. Samuel Chen bowed formally and promised her free laundry service for life, a gesture that made Clara laugh despite everything. Mrs. Blackwood squeezed her hand and whispered, You did it, child. You stood up and you won. Your mother would be proud. Martha stayed close protective as a mother hen, fending off the more aggressive well-wishers and giving Clara space to breathe. And Jonas remained at her side, silent, but present, his hand resting lightly on her back in that same supportive gesture he'd used so often over the past week. As they finally emerged from the courthouse into the afternoon sunshine, Clara stopped and tilted her face up to the warmth. A week ago, she'd been tied to a post in this same square, dying of thirst and terror, while her neighbors called her a witch. Today she was free. Her enemies were in chains, and the future stretched before her like an open road full of possibility and hope. What happens now? Martha asked, practical as always. Clara looked around the square at the post that still stood there, a silent reminder of injustice and survival, at the townspeople who were slowly, tentatively approaching her, as if testing whether it was safe to be kind, at the judge's carriage preparing to depart at Jonas. Standing watch with that patient, protective presence that had become so familiar. Now, Clara said slowly, I go home. I check on my land, my spring, my mother's grave. I remember who I am and who I want to be. She turned to Martha, then to the growing crowd around them. And then I build something new. A school, like Mrs. Blackwood said. a real school where any child can learn regardless of their parents' wealth or status or prejudices. A place where being different is celebrated instead of punished. A place that shows what Hollow Bend could be if we chose courage over fear. "We'll help," Martha said immediately, "however we can." "Count us in," Thomas added, Elizabeth nodding beside him. "And me," Samuel said quietly. "Every community needs education. Every child deserves a chance to become more than their circumstances." Others murmured agreement, and Clara felt something shift in the air around them. Not forgiveness exactly, because what had been done to her couldn't be erased by apologies or good intentions. But perhaps the beginning of something better. The possibility of transformation. The hope that people could learn from their mistakes and choose differently next time. Jonas touched her elbow gently. "We should get you home. You've been running on adrenaline for days. You need rest, real food, and time to process everything that's happened." Clara nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. But it was a good exhaustion, the kind that came from meaningful effort rather than hopeless struggle. As they walked through the square toward the street that would lead them to her property, Clara noticed something that made her stop in her tracks. Someone she didn't know who had hung flowers on the post where she'd been tied. Wildflowers, the kind that grew along the creek near her land, arranged in a simple bouquet. And beneath them, scratched into the wooden post with what looked like a knife point, were 3 words, "We are sorry." It wasn't enough. Nothing could ever be enough to make up for what they'd done. But it was something, a start, an acknowledgement that wrongs had been committed and that at least some people recognized them as wrongs. Clara reached out and touched the flowers gently, then turned away and kept walking. Behind her, Hollow Bend began the slow, painful work of examining its conscience and deciding what kind of town it wanted to be. Ahead of her, the road home stretched out under the Texas sun, leading to a small house with a pure spring running beneath it, where a woman's dreams had been buried but not destroyed, where new dreams could take root and grow toward the light. And beside her, walking in comfortable silence, was a scarred man who'd chosen kindness when cruelty would have been easier, who'd cut her loose when everyone else had walked away, who'd reminded her that even in the darkest moments there were still people worth believing in. As they reached the edge of town, Clara allowed herself one backward glance. Judge Morrison's carriage was disappearing down the road, carrying the promise of justice with it. Carver was locked in his own barn that had been converted into a temporary jail, facing consequences he'd never imagined possible. And the town square stood empty except for that post, those flowers, and the weight of everything that had happened there. "Thank you," Clara said to Jonas, the words inadequate but sincere. He looked at her with those steady gray eyes and smiled a real smile, warm and genuine. "Thank you for being brave enough to come back, for fighting when running would have been easier, for showing everyone that one person with courage can change everything." They walked on together toward home, toward the spring that had caused so much conflict and would now become the foundation of something better, toward a future that was uncertain but no longer defined by fear. And somewhere above them in the endless Texas sky, Clara's mother's spirit seemed to whisper approval on the wind, proud of the daughter who'd refused to be broken, who'd stood up when knocked down, who'd chosen justice over bitterness and hope over despair. The worst was over. The healing could begin. And Clara Wynne, the woman they'd called a witch and tried to destroy, was going home at last, not as a victim, but as a survivor, ready to build the world she'd always believed was possible. The house looked smaller than Clara remembered, or perhaps she'd simply grown larger in the weeks since she'd been dragged from it. The front door hung slightly ajar, left that way by whoever had ransacked the place, looking for evidence of witchcraft or simply taking advantage of her absence to steal whatever they could carry. Clara stood on the porch for a long moment, her hand on the weathered wood of the doorframe, gathering the courage to step inside and see what remained of the life she'd been forced to abandon. Jonas waited behind her, giving her space but staying close enough to help if she needed it. He'd been doing that all afternoon, maintaining a respectful distance while making it clear he wasn't going anywhere. It was a kindness Clara hadn't known she needed until she had it. She pushed the door open fully and stepped into the dim interior. The kitchen had been thoroughly searched, cupboards hanging open, flowers scattered across the floor. Her mother's good china smashed in what looked like deliberate vandalism rather than accidental breakage. The parlor was worse furniture, overturned curtains torn down, her father's books pulled from their shelves and thrown carelessly across the room. Someone had even slashed the cushions on her mother's rocking chair as if the furniture itself had been guilty of some crime. "I'm sorry," Jonas said quietly from the doorway. People get ugly when they're scared and looking for proof of what they want to believe. Clara bent to pick up one of her father's books, a volume of Emerson's essays that he'd read to her when she was small, teaching her that thinking for yourself was the highest form of courage. The spine was broken now, pages torn, but she held it against her chest anyway, a connection to the man who'd believed his daughter could be anything she chose to be. "They were looking for spell books," she said, her voice hollow. "Potion texts as evidence of dark magic. All they would have found were herb guides and poetry collections. My mother's recipes for treating common ailments. My father's philosophy books. Nothing sinister, nothing evil. Just knowledge which I suppose was threatening enough." She moved through the house room by room, cataloging the damage with a strange detachment. Her bedroom had been invaded, her personal things pawed through and discarded. Someone had even destroyed her mother's quilt, the one that had taken 3 years to complete, cutting it into pieces, as if the fabric itself could harbor evil. In the root cellar, her stores of preserved vegetables had been dumped out jars, broken food, wasted in an orgy of superstitious destruction. But when she stepped outside and walked to the small fenced area behind the house where her parents were buried, Clara felt her composure finally crack. The graves had been disturbed. Not dug up, thankfully, but the simple wooden crosses her mother had carved for her father and Clara had carved for her mother had been torn out and broken. Wildflowers Clara had planted last spring had been trampled flat. Someone had even left a crude drawing in the dirt, a stick figure of a woman hanging from a gallows with the word "witch" scratched beneath it. Clara sank to her knees between the graves, her body finally giving in to the weight of everything she'd been holding. The tears came hard and fast, tearing out of her chest in great heaving sobs that left her gasping for air. She wept for the violation of this sacred space, for the desecration of her parents' resting place, for the casual cruelty of people who'd once smiled at her in church and now destroyed everything she held dear. But more than that, she wept for the loss of innocence, for the death of the naive belief that goodness would be rewarded and justice would prevail without constant, exhausting vigilance. Jonas knelt beside her and pulled her against his chest, one hand cradling the back of her head while she soaked his shirt with tears. He didn't try to comfort her with empty words or tell her everything would be fine. He just held her while she broke apart, offering the silent support of his presence and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear. When the storm of grief finally passed, leaving Clara empty and wrung out but oddly cleansed, she pulled back and looked at Jonas through swollen eyes. "How do you do it?" she asked hoarsely. "How do you keep going when people show you the worst parts of themselves over and over? How do you not just give up?" Jonas was quiet for a moment, his thumb brushing away the tears on her cheek with unexpected gentleness. "You focus on the good parts," he finally said. "The Martha Hendrickses who find their courage. The Samuel Chens who keep meticulous records even when they think nobody cares. The Mrs. Blackwoods who climb onto barn roofs with rifles to protect people they believe in. You hold on to those moments and let them outweigh the darkness." He helped her to her feet, his hands steady on her arms. "And you remember that giving up means they win. The people who did this, who destroyed your home and desecrated your parents' graves, they want you to give up. They want you to be so broken that you'll leave and never come back. The best revenge is refusing to do what they expect." Clara looked at the vandalized graves, then at the house with its broken windows and ransacked rooms, then at the land stretching out around them, 20 acres of Texas earth that had sustained her family for 3 generations and would sustain her for 3 more if she had anything to say about it. Jonas was right. Running now after everything she'd fought for would be handing Carver a posthumous victory even from his jail cell. "Help me fix this," she said, gesturing to the graves. "I need to make it right before I can do anything else." They worked in the fading afternoon light, Jonas riding back to town to purchase new wood from the lumber yard, while Clara cleared away the broken crosses and trampled flowers. She raked the soil smooth, erasing the crude drawing and replacing it with careful patterns that her mother had taught her circles for eternity spirals for growth, simple symbols of love that transcended any religion's doctrine. When Jonas returned with fresh pine boards, Clara carved new crosses, with her father's old tools taking time to make them beautiful rather than merely functional. She burned her parents' names into the wood with a hot iron, adding dates and simple epitaphs that captured who they'd been: John Wynne, 1825 to 1881, a man who thought deeply and loved well, for her father, and Margaret Wynne, 1830–1884, a woman who healed with herbs and kindness, for her mother. As they planted the new crosses firmly in the ground, and Clara arranged fresh wildflowers around them, Jonas asked, "Do you want to say anything? Some kind of prayer or remembrance?" Clara considered for a moment, then shook her head. "My mother didn't believe in formal prayers. She said God heard thoughts as clearly as words, and that intention mattered more than recitation." She reached out and touched both crosses gently. "But I want them to know I survived, that I fought back, that their daughter didn't let fear break her even when it came close. I want them to know I'm going to build something here that will make them proud, not just for our family, but for everyone who's ever been told they don't matter." The sun was setting by the time they finished painting the sky in those impossible colors that only seem to exist in Texas. Deep purples and burning oranges and golds, so bright they almost hurt to look at. Clara stood between her parents' graves and watched the day die, feeling strangely at peace despite the devastation surrounding her. "I should start cleaning inside before it gets dark," she said finally. "The house is a disaster, but if we can clear enough space for sleeping, at least we'll have shelter tonight." They worked by lamplight, sweeping up broken glass and scattered flour, righting furniture that could be saved and stacking the pieces of what couldn't be repaired. Jonas proved surprisingly handy at basic carpentry, patching the worst of the damage with boards from the barn and promising to do more extensive repairs in the morning. Clara salvaged what she could from the ransacked cupboard. Some dishes had survived, and her cast-iron cookware was too heavy to have been worth stealing. As midnight approached, they'd managed to make the kitchen and one bedroom habitable. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was functional. Clara made a simple meal from supplies Jonas had brought: bread, cheese, dried beef, and coffee that tasted like heaven after a week of camp food. They ate in exhausted silence, too tired for conversation, but the silence was comfortable rather than awkward. "You should take the bedroom," Jonas said when they'd finished. "I'll bed down in the parlor. It's warm enough, and I've slept in worse places." Clara wanted to protest, to insist they could both have proper beds, but the truth was she desperately wanted privacy tonight, wanted space to process everything that had happened without having to perform strength for anyone else. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. For cutting me loose, for standing with me, for helping me reclaim my home. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Jonas stood and collected their dishes, carrying them to the basin for washing. "You don't repay kindness, Clara. You pass it forward. You build that school you talked about. You teach those children. You show this town what grace looks like even after they've shown you cruelty. That's payment enough." Clara watched him work this unexpected guardian who'd appeared when she needed him most and had asked for nothing in return. "Will you stay?" she asked suddenly. "Not just tonight, but longer. As sheriff, as a friend, as—" She stopped, unsure how to finish that sentence. Jonas turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "I'll stay as long as you need me to, as long as this town needs someone to stand between the vulnerable and the powerful. Beyond that," he shrugged. "I'm not good at staying, Clara. I've been running for 5 years trying to outpace grief and guilt. I don't know if I remember how to put down roots." "Maybe you could learn," Clara suggested softly. "Maybe we could both learn together, you how to stay me, how to trust again. Neither of us has to do it alone." Something shifted in Jonas's expression, a wall coming down behind those gray eyes. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Let's get through tomorrow first. One day at a time, like you said." Clara nodded and retreated to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. She changed into a clean nightdress she'd found buried in a drawer miraculously overlooked by the ransackers, and lay down on the narrow bed where she'd slept since childhood. The mattress was lumpy, and the room still smelled faintly of the herbs her mother used to hang from the rafters, but it was home. Her home, reclaimed through courage and testimony and the help of people who'd found their own courage when it mattered most. She slept deeply and dreamed of water, the spring beneath her house flowing pure and cold and endless, feeding crops and cattle and hope, sustaining life in all its forms. In her dream, children played beside the water, learning to read under the shade of oak trees, their laughter bright and clear. And standing watch over them was a man with gray eyes and a scarred face, no longer running, finally at peace. Morning arrived with birdsong and sunlight streaming through the patched window. Clara woke feeling more rested than she had in weeks, the sleep of the righteous after a battle won. She dressed quickly and emerged to find Jonas already awake, sitting on the front porch with coffee and watching the sun climb over the eastern hills. "Sleep well?" he asked as she joined him. "Better than I expected," Clara admitted, accepting the cup he offered. "I thought I'd lie awake all night replaying everything, but instead I just let go. My body knew it was safe to rest." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking coffee and watching the land wake up. In the distance, Clara could see her small herd of cattle grazing peacefully. Someone, probably Martha's husband, had apparently been feeding them in her absence. The sight of them alive and healthy brought a lump to her throat. Even in the midst of mob violence, individual kindnesses had persisted. "I've been thinking about your school," Jonas said eventually, "about where you'd build it and how you'd fund it. Carver's assets are frozen, which means his various properties will likely go to auction once the investigation concludes. If you could get your hands on some of that land, particularly the parcels near the creek where the children gather anyway, you'd have space for a proper school building and room to expand later." Clara considered this, her strategic mind engaging despite her exhaustion. The Johnsons should get their ranch back, that's only justice. "But you're right about the creek parcels. Carver acquired them from the Miller family 5 years ago under suspicious circumstances. If those could be allocated for educational purposes—" She trailed off, possibilities blooming in her imagination like wildflowers after rain. "Judge Morrison seems inclined to make restitution where possible," Jonas continued, "and establishing a school would be good for the whole territory. The territorial government has been pushing for more educational institutions. They might even provide funding if you can prove the need and show you have local support." "Local support?" Claire repeated with a bitter laugh. "A week ago, the locals wanted me dead. Now I'm supposed to count on them to support a school." "People change," Jonas said simply. "Not all of them, not overnight, but some of them. The ones who hung flowers on that post yesterday, who whispered apologies, who looked ashamed when you walked past those people, want a chance to be better than they were. Give them that chance. Not for their sake, but for the children's." Before Clara could respond, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Both of them tensed hands, moving instinctively toward weapons, but the riders that emerged from the tree line were Martha and her husband, accompanied by Thomas and Elizabeth Johnson. Samuel Chen driving a small wagon, and Mrs. Blackwood sitting ramrod straight in the wagon bed, like a queen surveying her domain. "We thought you might need help with repairs," Martha called out as they approached. "And we brought supplies, food, tools, some furniture from our attics to replace what was destroyed." Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion as she watched them dismount and start unloading the wagon. Thomas carried a sturdy kitchen table. Elizabeth brought baskets of fresh bread and preserves. Samuel had bundles of fabric for new curtains and bedding, and Mrs. Blackwood produced a crate of books and readers and primers and literature texts that could form the foundation of a school library. "You don't have to do this," Clara protested weakly. "Yes, we do," Mrs. Blackwood said firmly, climbing down from the wagon with surprising agility. "We let fear turn us into accomplices to evil. The only way to atone for that is through action. So today we act. We help rebuild what was destroyed. And tomorrow we start planning how to build something new and better." The day that followed was exhausting but healing. They worked together to restore Clara's house, the men repairing structural damage, while the women cleaned and organized, everyone contributing what they could. Neighbors started arriving throughout the morning, some bringing more supplies, others just offering awkward apologies and tentative help. Young Emily Marsh showed up with her mother, both of them carrying armfuls of wildflowers to replace those that had been trampled at the graves. By mid-afternoon, the house looked almost livable again. The furniture was mismatched, and there were still gaps where things had been stolen or destroyed beyond repair, but it felt like home. More than that, it felt like community proof that even after terrible things happened, people could choose to come together rather than fall apart. As they took a break for lunch, eating in Clara's newly restored kitchen, Mrs. Blackwood pulled out a notebook and started making lists. If we're serious about this school, we need to plan properly. Location, building materials, curriculum, teacher training, it's a substantial undertaking. I can teach, Clara said immediately. Basic reading, writing, arithmetic. My mother taught me herbal medicine and practical sciences. My father taught me literature and philosophy. I'm not formally trained, but I can provide a foundation. And I can supplement with classical education, Mrs. Blackwood added. History, geography, Latin, if any of the students are interested. Between the two of us, we could offer a curriculum that rivals what they'd get in Dallas or Austin. Martha's husband cleared his throat nervously. If Carver's financial records are going to be entered as evidence in his trial, someone will need to organize them properly, create summaries and analyses that judges and juries can understand. That's skilled work, accounting, legal documentation, that sort of thing. I could teach those skills to older students, prepare them for clerical work or business management. Samuel Chen nodded thoughtfully. And practical trades should be included. Not everyone needs Latin and philosophy. Some children will benefit more from learning carpentry, metalworking, tailoring. I could teach textile skills, sewing, dyeing, pattern making. Those are marketable abilities that can support a family. The conversation grew more animated as others contributed ideas. Thomas Johnson offered to teach animal husbandry and sustainable ranching practices. Elizabeth suggested courses in home economics and nutrition. Even Jonas, initially silent, eventually spoke up to propose classes in basic law and civil rights, teaching young people how to recognize injustice and use legal systems to combat it rather than resorting to violence or vigilante action. This isn't just a school, Clara said slowly, realization dawning. This is a vision for a different kind of community, one where education isn't limited to the wealthy, where practical skills are valued alongside academic ones, where children learn to think critically instead of just accepting what they're told. It's revolutionary, Mrs. Blackwood agreed with satisfaction, which means we'll face opposition. Not everyone in Hollow Bend is ready to embrace change, even after Carver's exposure. Some people benefit from ignorance and limited opportunities. It keeps labor cheap and populations controllable. We need to be prepared for resistance. Let them resist, Clara said, her voice hardening with determination. I'm done being afraid of what people might do or say. They already did their worst. They tied me to a post and left me to die. I survived that. I can survive their disapproval. Jonas reached across the table and squeezed her hand briefly. That's the spirit. And as interim sheriff, I can make sure any resistance stays within legal bounds. Anyone who tries to interfere with lawful educational activities will answer to me. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning in earnest, creating budgets and timelines and strategies for securing funding. Mrs. Blackwood drafted a formal proposal to submit to the Territorial Education Board. Martha volunteered to organize a town meeting to present their plans and gauge community support. Samuel offered to use his business connections to source building materials at reasonable prices. Piece by piece, the dream started taking concrete shape. As evening approached and their impromptu planning session wound down, Clara walked her visitors to their horses and wagons, thanking each one individually for their help and support. When only Jonas remained sitting on the porch and watching the sunset paint the sky in those impossible colors, again, Clara joined him with 2 cups of fresh coffee. Do you think it's possible? She asked. Building something this ambitious in a town that just tried to kill me, Jonas considered the question seriously. I think people are capable of extraordinary change when they're given the opportunity and the encouragement. I also think change is hard and slow and uncomfortable, and a lot of people will resist it simply because comfort is easier than growth. He turned to look at her directly. But yes, I think it's possible, because you're possible. A week ago you were tied to a post, and today you're planning a school. If you can transform that completely, this town can too. Clara thought about that as darkness fell and the stars began to emerge overhead. She thought about Eli Carver sitting in his makeshift jail cell, probably still convinced that his wealth and connections would save him. She thought about Judge Morrison returning to his home with evidence that would likely end Carver's freedom for the rest of his natural life. She thought about all the small acts of courage that had led to this moment. Martha keeping records, Samuel documenting injustice, Mrs. Blackwood preserving correspondence, Thomas and Elizabeth refusing to forget what had been done to them. Most of all, she thought about Jonas Red, a man running from grief who'd stopped running long enough to cut a stranger loose and ended up finding something worth staying for. "I'm scared," Clara admitted quietly. Not of Carver anymore, or even of the people who supported him, but of failing, of building something and watching it collapse because I wasn't strong enough or smart enough or dedicated enough to sustain it. "Fear of failure is healthy," Jonas said. "It means you care enough to worry about doing things right. But here's what I've learned from tracking dangerous men across territories for 20 years: the ones who succeed aren't the ones without fear. They're the ones who feel fear and do the necessary thing anyway. You've already proven you can do that. Everything else is just details." They sat in companionable silence as full darkness descended the night alive with cricket song and the distant howl of a coyote. Clara's body ached from the day's work, her hands blistered from unfamiliar tools, her mind exhausted from planning and hoping and allowing herself to imagine a future that didn't involve constant vigilance against persecution. But it was a good exhaustion, the kind that came from meaningful labor rather than meaningless suffering. "Tell me about your wife," Clara said suddenly. "About Sarah. You said she was good, but what was she really like?" Jonas was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. Then slowly he began to talk about a woman who loved books and horses, who could make anything grow in even the poorest soil, who laughed easily and forgave quickly, and believed the best of people until they proved her wrong. He talked about their ranch, small but sufficient, and their plans to expand to build a life that mattered. He talked about the morning he'd left to track a fugitive, and the evening he'd returned to find her dead. His world destroyed by men who saw other people as obstacles rather than human beings. "I've been angry for 5 years," Jonas admitted. "Angry at the men who killed her, angry at myself for not being there, angry at a world where good people suffer and evil people prosper. I tracked down the men responsible, and I dealt with them legally through the system, which felt inadequate, but at least kept my soul relatively intact. And then I just drifted, taking jobs that didn't matter, staying places that didn't feel like home, running from the memory of happiness because remembering hurt too much." He paused, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, staring into the darkness. "But this past week, helping you, standing up to Carver, watching you refuse to break no matter how hard they pushed it, reminded me why I became a lawman in the first place. Not for the badge or the authority, but because I believed in justice. Because I thought one person could make a difference if they tried hard enough. Sarah believed that too. She would have liked you." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but they were gentle tears rather than the anguished sobs of yesterday. "I would have liked her too, I think. Anyone you loved that much must have been special." She hesitated, then added softly, "You know you don't have to stay here out of obligation, right? You've already done more than anyone could expect. If you need to keep moving, to keep running, I'll understand." Jonas finally turned to look at her, his face barely visible in the starlight. "What if I don't want to run anymore? What if I'm tired of being angry and alone? What if I think maybe possibly there's a reason I rode into Hollow Bend that particular day, at that particular moment?" He set down his coffee cup and reached for her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "I'm not making promises I can't keep, Clara. I'm too damaged and you're too raw for either of us to know what tomorrow looks like. But I'm saying I want to find out. I'm saying I want to stay long enough to see your school built and your garden planted and your life reclaimed. And after that, we'll see." Clara squeezed his hand, holding on like it was an anchor in a storm-tossed sea. "That's enough," she whispered. "More than enough. One day at a time, remember." They sat like that for a long while, hands clasped in the darkness, two broken people allowing themselves to imagine the possibility of healing. In the distance, the spring beneath Clara's house continued its eternal flow, pure water rising from deep earth to sustain life in all its forms. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, town meetings, and construction plans, and the slow, difficult work of rebuilding trust in a fractured community. But tonight, under the vast Texas sky, Clara Wynne and Jonas Red allowed themselves to simply be survivors who'd chosen courage over despair, justice over revenge, hope over bitterness. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Judge Morrison's investigation uncovered even more extensive corruption than anyone had suspected. Carver had been defrauding the territory for over a decade, his schemes touching everything from land sales to water rights to educational funding. The scandal made headlines across Texas, and lawyers from Austin arrived to handle the prosecution. Carver's trial was scheduled for 3 months out, but everyone knew the outcome was predetermined. He'd spend the rest of his life in prison, his empire dismantled and sold to pay restitution to his victims. The Johnsons got their ranch back with damages for their years of hardship. Samuel Chen received reimbursement for 5 years of overcharges, plus compensation for emotional distress. Mrs. Blackwood was awarded the education funds that had been embezzled, plus additional territory money to establish a proper school. And Clara was given first right of refusal on the creek parcels that Carver had stolen from the Miller family, with the territorial government covering the cost as compensation for her unlawful detention and attempted murder. The town meeting to present the school plans drew nearly every resident of Hollow Bend and several families from outlying ranches. There was opposition. Reverend Cartwright, trying to rebuild his own damaged reputation, argued that education should be firmly rooted in religious doctrine and controlled by the church. Several ranch owners worried that educated workers would demand higher wages and better conditions. A handful of families objected to their children being taught alongside Chinese students, or the children of former criminals, or anyone else deemed undesirable by polite society. But for every voice of opposition, 2 more rose in support. Parents who'd seen their children struggle with illiteracy spoke passionately about the importance of education. Young people testified about wanting opportunities beyond ranch work or domestic service. And Thomas Johnson, standing before his neighbors with quiet dignity, talked about what it meant to have everything stolen by a man who faced no consequences until someone was brave enough to stand up and demand justice. "My children won't grow up in a world where power matters more than truth," Thomas said, his voice ringing through the crowded meeting hall. And the only way to ensure that is through education, teaching the next generation to think critically, question authority when necessary, and fight for what's right, even when it's difficult. That's what Miss Wynne is offering. That's what this school represents. And anyone who opposes it is basically saying they prefer ignorance to enlightenment, which tells you everything you need to know about their motives. The vote was decisive, 73 in favor of the school, 28 opposed. It wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. Construction began the following week with volunteers from across the territory contributing labor and materials. Jonas oversaw the building project when he wasn't busy reforming the sheriff's department and training a new generation of deputies who understood that their job was to protect the vulnerable rather than enforce the preferences of the powerful. Clara threw herself into curriculum development, working with Mrs. Blackwood to create lesson plans that balanced academic rigor with practical application. They ordered books from publishers in New York and Chicago, secured science equipment through Mrs. Blackwood's Education Board connections, and established a scholarship fund for students whose families couldn't afford supplies. Samuel Chen taught a pilot course in textile arts that proved so popular they had to create a waiting list. Martha organized a library committee and started soliciting book donations from across the territory. The school building rose from the creek bank like a promise made manifest, 2 stories of sturdy pine and stone with large windows to let in natural light and a separate wing for practical workshops. They painted it white with gold trim, the colors of hope and prosperity. And Jonas carved an inscription above the main door, "You don't have to be perfect, you just have to stay." When Clara saw those words rendered in beautiful script across the lintel, she started crying right there in the muddy construction site. Jonas found her standing alone, staring up at his handiwork, tears streaming down her face. "Too much?" he asked with concern. "I can change it if—" "It's perfect," Clara interrupted, turning to face him with a smile that was equal parts joy and gratitude. "It's exactly right. That's what we're teaching here, isn't it? That making mistakes is acceptable as long as you keep trying. That falling down matters less than getting back up. That staying matters more than perfection." The school opened on a warm day in early October, 3 months after Clara had been tied to that post and left to die. Over 40 students enrolled on the first day, ranging from 6-year-olds learning their letters to teenagers studying advanced mathematics and vocational skills. Clara taught the younger children while Mrs. Blackwood handled the older students, both of them discovering that education was less about transferring information and more about kindling curiosity. Emily Marsh proved to be one of their brightest students, soaking up knowledge, like dry earth absorbing rain. Her friend Sarah, whose father had initially forbidden her attendance, showed up anyway after her mother intervened and threatened to leave her husband if he didn't allow their daughter this opportunity. More girls enrolled than boys, initially surprising everyone until Mrs. Blackwood pointed out that boys had more options for employment and education through apprenticeships, so naturally their families were less motivated to pursue formal schooling. That will change, Clara predicted. As we prove our value as our students start achieving things their parents never dreamed possible, more families will send their sons. Give it time. Time proved her right. By the end of the first term, enrollment had doubled, and they were already planning an expansion to accommodate more students and offer more specialized courses. The Territory Education Board sent inspectors who were so impressed they increased funding and started citing Clara's school as a model for other communities. Journalists from Dallas and Houston came to write articles about the woman who'd survived a witch hunt and turned her trauma into transformation for an entire region. But the most meaningful moment came on a quiet afternoon in November, when Loretta Pike appeared at the school's front door with her hat in her hands and guilt written across her face. Clara was in the middle of a lesson on basic arithmetic, teaching her students to add and subtract using beans and sticks, when Mrs. Blackwood appeared in the doorway and gestured that Clara had a visitor. Loretta stood in the hallway looking like she wanted to run, her face pale and her hands trembling. Clara dismissed her class for an early break and invited Loretta into the small office she shared with Mrs. Blackwood. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Loretta said immediately, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I know what I did was unforgivable. I blamed you for my baby's death, because blaming you was easier than accepting that sometimes terrible things just happen. I let Carver manipulate my grief, and I nearly got you killed, and I've been living with that guilt every day since." She finally looked up, meeting Clara's eyes. "I can't take it back. I can't undo what I did, but I wanted you to know that I see it now, see what I was part of, see how wrong it was. And I wanted to ask if there's anything at all I can do to make amends." Clara was quiet for a long moment, studying the woman who'd been her primary accuser. Loretta looked older than she had 3 months ago, grief and guilt aging her prematurely. Clara thought about holding on to anger, about refusing forgiveness, about making Loretta suffer the way Clara had suffered. It would be justified. It would even feel good, probably, at least initially. But then she thought about what Jonas had said that first night by the campfire, that you focus on the good parts and let them outweigh the darkness. She thought about Emily learning to read, and Sarah defying her father, and 40 children discovering that knowledge was power. She thought about the spring beneath her house, flowing pure despite the corruption that had tried to poison it. "You can help," Clara said finally. "We need volunteer assistance, people to help younger children with reading practice, to organize the library, to prepare materials for lessons. It's unpaid work and often tedious, but it's necessary. If you're serious about making amends, show up twice a week and help us teach. Show this community that people can change, that mistakes don't have to define us forever." Loretta's face crumpled with relief and gratitude. "I'll be here, every Tuesday and Thursday, or any day you need me. Thank you, Clara. Thank you for giving me a chance to be better." She left quickly, as if afraid Clara might change her mind, and Clara stood alone in the office trying to process what she'd just done. Part of her felt foolish for offering kindness to someone who'd shown her cruelty, but a larger part felt liberated, as if she'd just set down a heavy burden she'd been carrying without realizing its weight. Jonas found her there an hour later, staring out the window at students playing in the yard during their lunch break. He didn't ask what was wrong, he just stood beside her, his presence comforting as always. "Loretta Pike was here," Clara said eventually. "She apologized, asked how she could make amends. I told her she could volunteer at the school." Jonas nodded slowly. "That was generous of you." "Was it generous or was it weak?" Clara asked. "She tried to have me killed. Should I really be letting her anywhere near children I'm responsible for?" "I think," Jonas said carefully, "that there's a difference between forgiving someone and trusting them. You can give Loretta a chance to do better without forgetting what she did. You can allow for the possibility of redemption without being naive about human nature. That's not weakness, that's wisdom." Clara leaned against him slightly, and his arm came around her shoulders naturally. They'd fallen into this pattern over the months, Casual touches, comfortable proximity, a relationship that was more than friendship but hadn't quite become romance yet. Neither of them was in a hurry to define it. They were both too busy building new lives to worry about labels. "I'm proud of you," Jonas said quietly. "Not just for the school, but for staying open despite everything. For choosing hope over bitterness. For being strong enough to offer second chances even when you didn't receive one yourself." The school term ended in December with a celebration that drew the entire community. Students performed recitations and demonstrated what they'd learned, parents provided food, and Mrs. Blackwood gave a speech about the importance of education that had several people dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Clara stood at the back of the crowded schoolhouse and looked around at faces that had once been twisted with hatred, now filled with pride and joy. Not everyone had changed. Reverend Cartwright still preached sermons about the dangers of secular education, and a handful of families refused to let their children attend on principle. But the vast majority had embraced this new possibility, had allowed themselves to imagine a future where their children could become more than circumstances had prepared them to be. As the celebration wound down and families began departing into the cold December night, Jonas appeared at Clara's elbow with 2 cups of mulled cider. They walked together to the small cemetery behind the school where Clara had transplanted her parents' graves, along with those of other early settlers whose resting places had been neglected or disturbed over the years. It had become a memorial garden of sorts, a place to remember those who'd built the foundations on which the current community stood. Clara knelt beside her parents' graves and brushed away fallen leaves, the restored crosses standing straight and proud in the moonlight. "I did it," she whispered to them. "I built something that matters. I survived, and I didn't let survival make me bitter. I hope you're proud." The wind rustled through the bare tree branches, and Clara chose to interpret it as approval. She stood and turned to Jonas, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'm staying," he said abruptly. "Not as interim sheriff. The town council offered me the permanent position, and I accepted. Not because I'm done running from Sarah's memory, but because I think maybe I've run far enough. Maybe it's time to build something instead of just protecting what others built." Clara's heart leaped, but she kept her voice steady. "What changed your mind?" Jonas gestured around them at the school building, at the memorial garden, at the town lights twinkling in the distance. "This. You. The possibility that maybe broken people can heal if they're given time and purpose and someone who believes in them." He stepped closer, his hands finding hers. "I'm not perfect, Clara. I'm still angry sometimes, still haunted by things I couldn't prevent. But I'm learning to live with that, and I'd like to learn beside you if you're willing." Clara looked up at this man who'd cut her loose when everyone else had walked away, who'd stood with her through testimony and trials and transformation. "One day at a time," she asked softly. "One day at a time," Jonas agreed. And then he kissed her, gentle and careful, a beginning rather than a culmination. They walked back to Clara's house together, hands linked, the winter stars brilliant overhead. The spring beneath the house continued its eternal flow, pure water rising from deep earth to sustain life in all its forms. And in the small white schoolhouse by the creek, books waited on shelves for students who would return after winter break to continue learning that knowledge was power, that courage mattered more than perfection, and that choosing to stay, was the bravest thing anyone could do. Clara Wynne had been tied to a post and called a witch. She had survived terror and injustice and the casual cruelty of frightened people. And from that survival, she had built something extraordinary, not just a school, but a promise. A promise that mistakes didn't have to be permanent, that communities could heal, that one person's courage could ripple outward and change everything. The rope burns on her wrists had faded to thin white scars barely visible except in certain lights. But Clara wore them as badges of honor, rather than shame, reminders that she had broken, yes, but she had also mended, that she had been knocked down but had chosen to stand again, that no rope, no post, no mob's fury could hold a heart that chose to forgive without forgetting to build, without bitterness, to hope, despite every reason not to. In the years that followed, Clara's school would grow into an institution renowned across Texas, producing graduates who became teachers and lawyers and doctors and artists. Jonas would serve as sheriff for 20 years, training deputies who understood that justice meant protecting the powerless rather than empowering the strong. and Hollow Bend would transform from a town defined by fear into a community characterized by resilience and hope. But that night, walking home under the winter stars, Clara and Jonas were simply two people choosing to stay when running would have been easier, choosing each other when isolation would have been safer, choosing hope when despair whispered that hope was foolish. And somewhere in the darkness, carried on the wind that had witnessed everything, came a whisper that might have been Clara's mother, or might have been the land itself, ancient and patient and wise. Well done, daughter. Well done.